Good evening, everyone. Well, depending on what time zone you're listening to slash viewing this in, because VODs exist and so do time zones. So that's I don't know, that's kind of a weird one, I guess. But it's evening UK time. In
Yes.
case you guys don't know or you don't catch this live, this gets put out 9 p.m. UK time. And although if you are here right now in the UK, that's redundant knowledge. But yes, that's
It's good evening, and everybody else is wrong. What time you're watching it, it will then be the evening when you're watching it. I don't care about reality.
that's true. That's true. But yes, we
Yeah.
are.
Yes, it
We are
is.
live once again.
It is.
Back once again.
It is 9 p.m. on a Thursday, and VODs. Yes, you'll just have to deal with it.
Time zones are a social construct. If you wonder why we waffle at the beginning of these streams and don't get straight into it, it's because going live, we have to wait for everyone's connections to refresh, basically. Because, yeah, if you're ever waiting for the stream, by the way, I know you can't hear this right now, but if you've been sat there for a while and we cut in after like 2 minutes, just refresh. When it says waiting for me, just refresh.
Yeah.
That's advice I always give people with streams, because YouTube is terrible at actually starting them on other people's end. So that's the whole thing there. But God, this is episode 5 of the mainline series, and we've done like what 3 special episodes so far
I think.
as
Well, 3 if you count the one that broke, and so on. I think we're on, as far as my categorization folder is concerned, we're on episode 7 plus the Liberty and History one, and yeah, ish, sort of.
We've done 2 Q&As as well, because we did a Q&A and then we did a special about how to use the source materials.
Yes.
So that's technically like 9
Yeah,
streams.
yeah. I remember the first when we were discussing this before the first episode. It was it'll be about 8 episodes or so. It'll be just one every 10 years, and then maybe a couple of. But we've done it. It'll be no problem. It'll be 19 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. Job done. Yeah, sure. But I think it's been. I'm been really, really enjoying it so far, and lots to read. Although this week was it, I don't know. I've been playing too much Bannerlord, and a little Deus Ex up until the weekend. I need to finish that. I really need to finish.
You do.
I got like halfway.
I think I linked it in a community post, but yes, Trig does occasionally stream video games on his own YouTube channel. And
yes.
You've been playing Deus Ex most recently, haven't you?
Original Deus Ex, yes. I've missed one important conversation out of all of them so far. There's a good conversation to have with the barman in Hong Kong, but that game had some really, really, really base little snippets of information in amongst the gameplay. So I I thought I'd expose it to some people who were willing to be exposed to. For that, anyway.
You've been exposing yourself to people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You shouldn't be doing that. You really shouldn't. No, we're finally back into the time period. I know a lot of you guys have been bearing with us with this. I'm honestly happy with how this is all lined up, because a lot of this stuff we're talking about today has been set up quite beautifully. In fact, I've got a lot, again, there's a lot of reading to go through in this one, and a lot of historical kind of sources and context. But there's certain stuff that we'll be talking about and not reading, because we can actually refer back to our earlier reading at this point, which is quite advantageous, I think.
Nice. Yes.
Yeah. Before we start some normal YouTubey stuff, the best way to donate to us is still on Streamlabs. If you do want to donate, that is in the video description, but it gets cut out by like the read more section, so I'll put that in the chat. That'll be the pinned message. We still have the join function. We still have super chats. We're actually still fully monetized on YouTube because, well, we're being heavily filtered. Honestly, I know a lot of you guys have been telling me you've not been seeing our videos. That's just the reality of being a YouTube channel on online that talks about things that are controversial, because we have done a couple of the stream we did with Peter Aquinas and one of the videos I did with Evelyn. We talked about COVID, which is a big no-no word, and gets you basically yeeted, half yeeted from the platform already. So that is why you're not seeing it, because we talked about the coof, but we're not going to censor our content or censor what we say because of YouTube's policies.
Absolutely,
that's never been what I've done. So
no,
as to other people's detriment occasionally. But
yes.
I don't know. my policy is that if you let YouTube control what you say, you might as well not do anything anymore. Like if you're going to tailor your content to YouTube's terms of service, then what you might as well be Jake Paul. You know, you might as well be fucking Philip DeFranco talking about the CNN headlines.
Never
And,
go full DeFranco.
No, never go full DeFranco. But yeah, that's my whole policy on it. That just you do not comply. So we will not comply.
Absolutely goddamn
But anyway.
Right. Oh, yes. We have actually already had a not a super chat, but a Streamlabs or whatever it was. Yes, the thing.
We've had a Streamlabs donation. Yes, I just saw it there. That's $11. $11.23 from I have no cash and I must simp. Just saying hello to you too, friend. Hello. Yes.
Indeed.
Audience participation is encouraged and appreciated, and do strap in because this will be another long one. So.
I have my beers. Plural. Oh no, actually, I have a bottle, and I haven't got a bottle opener nearby. You will know. You will. There will be in about an hour's time a me running downstairs noises. I'm afraid.
That's fine. It's to be expected. I know when you start ranting, sometimes I'll go away, have a quick piss, refill my water, and you'll still be going. So that's one of my little behind the scenes spoiler there.
Fair enough. I start me on communists. I will.
I've also just been brought some tea, so that's very advantageous. Just as we're talking about this. What are we talking about? Very good.
Yes. Hello.
We have found ourselves in 1929.
We have.
The Wall Street crash has happened, but as we explained last time, it is merely a symptom of the underlying weaknesses of the Western economies that have been dragging on really since the First World War, and as a consequence of the First World War and the policies that preceded it.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to say that. There were a lot of people struggling at the time and going, "Oh no, I cannot put food on my table." Merely a consequence is we're not belittling the struggling that the little guy went through, because Wall Street were a bunch of dicks once more. But such is unfortunately the life that we and they lead.
Well, yeah,
it seems
it's a subject we talked about last time, that most people in the new mass democracies, which are really only about 7 or 8 years old at this point. This is less than a decade at the beginning of this time period into the mass democracy experiment. The 19th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act both massively enhanced the franchise, and during this period we will start to see even more of the consequences of it. We saw, in the early 20s with the bringing of prohibition, which is still in place until 1933, and we saw it in the UK with stuff like unemployment insurance, and the electorates in both places both voting to fuck over who they don't like and to enrich themselves. But we really, within the reaction to the Great Depression and the willful abandonment of a lot of the traditional political kind of trappings of the 30s, where people just go whole hog, we'll really see the democratization aspect and the fruits of it going to full overdrive. But it's the world of 1929 is a place of shortages. It's a place of queues. It is in the short term a place of hardship that is being very immediately blamed on the bankers and the capitalists. As you can see there in the slide we've got there, that is actually an unemployment line in the UK from the period. You can probably see all the flat caps, because that was the order of the day. It was kind of like workmen, overcoats, flat caps, cobbled streets, very kind of old Britannia still, but they were adjusting to the fact that they were no longer an empire. This is only really, depending on how you measure it, this is only really 9 to 13 years out from the geographical and population numbers height of the British Empire.
Horrendous period of time to be living in many respects as well. I mean, the deprivation, the there's something to be said for the social welfare system in that keeping people from this level of sort of poverty, but oh my fucking word, the fact that it's basically been created almost to drive the necessity for a social welfare system is somewhat worrisome.
Well,
But
it's as we talked about with the Benjamin Strong stuff. It is
yeah,
just the fact that they were trying to keep this going as long as possible. They knew a crash was coming. They knew a crash was inevitable, but they were just trying to delay it as long as they could because they'd locked themselves in on the inflationist trajectory. But
yeah,
as we are in 1929, we have a Labour government in the UK, and we have a Republican government in the US. We have both new governments, the new government of Ramsay MacDonald and the new government of Herbert Hoover, both
yes,
really just get saddled with this in the beginning of their political kind of careers at the top, at the beginning of their premierships, and it's kind of it's amazing that in 1929, a lot of what we'll see by 1939, and especially through 31 and 33, are seen as dangerous monetary instruments. A lot of the practices that we talked about that were done in Germany, the monetarism, the inflationism,
yeah,
the pure unmooring from the gold standard. At this point, is kind of complicated because Britain was really playing the okey cokey with the gold standard at the time, trying to hide how it had inflated itself. And yeah, the USA had a kind of gold related standard, but it didn't have a pure gold standard. A lot of the gold standard stuff is a little bit outside the remit of these streams. But what I will say is that both the UK and the US have a semi gold standard. They at least profess to be committed to the gold standard, even though in economic reality they often aren't.
yeah.
Um,
No, we were heading towards fiat currency even back then. And as we will see later, the gold standard does start to play a part in, well, towards the later part of the 30s, shall we say, when they outright banned owning gold and that type of thing. But that was just in America, though, wasn't it? It wasn't in England. Was it in England? No,
no, that was not in England. No.
no.
It's interesting though. I don't have a link up because I don't want to go through it in too much detail. But the unemployment rate, even by the time that you hit 1930, is only about 8.7% in the US. Here in the UK, let me just find that. Sorry,
Yeah.
I did have it up earlier.
That's it. It only seemed to hit the Great Depression only seemed to hit certain coastal cities as well.
Yes.
Because you had places like sort of Texas and what are now rather derogatorily termed as the flyover states actually doing okay. They were okay, the money's not coming in, but because we're farmers we still have plenty to eat, etc. But New York suffered. Good God, New York was in a right old state.
It's important to remember that the unemployment both in the US and the UK really only hit its height in 33.
Yeah.
I think it was about 25% in the UK at its height. And in the US at its height, I think it was about the same. It's about 33 to... where is that? Sorry. No, it was about 24%. So both of them hit about a quarter unemployment rate during this period. Again, this is just framing, but it's important to remember. And as we will go into, there was a lot of immediate interventionism that was done very much in the mold of Roosevelt and the New Deal. And again, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but the world of 1929 is one where people are willing to intervene to an extent, but a lot of the instruments that they intervene in are still quite rightly seen as dangerous and irresponsible. But really, it's a case of they don't know what else to do. I don't know. Is there anything you want to add about 1929 and the way things are?
At this point, no. I mean, I think we can go on because I just noticed Yiz is asking us to go on a stream with her tomorrow. I might be up for that. Yiz. I don't know about you, but I know I've also been asked to pop into it on Sunday
Yes,
to a stream.
I know that Yiz has had a whole bunch of trouble with having a whole bunch of accounts banned again. I've
Yeah,
been trying to get in contact with her. Um I don't know what the best way to do that is, but maybe I don't know. I might be recording something tomorrow, actually to be uploaded to this channel at some point. I'm hoping to create a new show completely different to what we're talking about in this stuff. Do one more about internet history and culture and some of the old fag stuff that I've been witness to. But yeah, um, it's a lot of people getting yeeted at the moment, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen to us. So I know Yiz has been quite unfortunate with that. But there is something I've completely forgotten from my notes that I want to keep reminding people, which is that the map of Europe is still in its fictitious kind of 1919, 1920 state that was set up by Woodrow Wilson. And the Great
yeah,
Depression, we don't have time to talk about this really, but the Great Depression ends up adding a huge amount of friction to that. It ends up creating a huge amount of tension in these new kind of cobbled together nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. It really does just pour, petrol on the ethnic tension fires that are kind of smoldering in those areas already.
yes, because we have the corridor between Germany and old Germanic states through Poland, which become a source of
Yes.
tension later on. In fact, you might even say the reason that Hitler invaded was to essentially save what may or may not have been ethnic cleansing that was going off at the time.
It was an excuse, yes, but
Yes,
it was also to do with the land losses due to the borders of Germany were very much in dispute still. But that is something to keep in the back of your minds as this whole thing unfolds. That the situation in a lot of Central and Eastern European countries is made very not ideal by all of this because they were already an ethnic and political hodgepodge. But yeah, we can get on to what is important to bear in mind, which is Herbert Hoover and his interventionism, because we talked about it again in episode 4 when he was part of the Treasury and the cabinet under Calvin Coolidge,
yeah,
and Herbert Hoover was actually the person who was telling Coolidge to be more interventionist. It's as we'll
yes,
get
he
into with
was.
some of the quotes, yeah, the quotes from Rothbard, because I've got 3 here. I don't think we'll have time to read them all, but I just wanted to show there's like 3 really good sources to just really nail, anyone who might come back and say that laissez-faire was, Herbert Hoover's policy, because it never, ever, ever was.
No, no, he was very much an interventionalist. Just look at that. Look at that picture with those guys just standing there. Health and safety would shit themselves at the sight of that these days. And well,
Well, well, that's a great example of his interventionism of public work, which is the Hoover Dam being built.
yeah. Which oh my god, oh my word, there's a lot of bodies buried in that dam.
Of
Um,
course, yeah.
oof, oof. That was it's a great piece of engineering, without a doubt. But oof, good lord, there was a lot of people died building that. Um, did it serve its purpose? Well, it's still there. It's still producing power. See, there's something to be said for government works like dams and roads, etc., and whether or not they help in times of economic downturn. But it can't be the only methodology, and it's got to get paid off.
Well,
Keynesianism is
yes.
yes.
We will get into again once we start talking about some of the New Deal stuff. That the wastage of government expenditure and the appropriation from normal capital and capitalists and the warping of the market. Actually, a lot of people agree that in the early stages, both Hoover and Roosevelt made the Depression worse
Yeah.
through their inept attempts to correct, the market by force. The first link we've got here, which we probably won't get up, is a little essay by Rothbard, because Rothbard's really good at this early period.
Do you want to do the which one's that, the Hoover fights the Great Depression one? Yeah.
Just get Hoover's attack on laissez-faire up first, just so we can show people that exists.
Hoover.
A lot of stuff,
Yeah.
yeah, because this really goes into a lot of the earlier stuff Hoover did, but this is a great one if you just want to show people. There's 3 we've got here, like I said. There's also there's a great paragraph at the beginning. This is in the Progressive Era by Rothbard. We're using the HTML version, and this is in the section marked. This is section 15, Herbert Hoover and the myth of laissez-faire, and this is section 2 of that whole thing.
Oh.
So I've just lost it here myself, which is literally just called Herbert Hoover Fights the Great Depression. I think that's the wrong one, Trig. That's the.
That is the wrong one. Okay, we're gonna.
That's the Herbert Hoover's. Yeah, this is the Progressive Era. I'm sorry. I'm getting it wrong. This is Rothbard's Progressive Era, section 15.2.
Yeah.
It's a problem. I think it's quite far down the page there. I'm afraid. If you want to control F for mobilizer and economic planner. It's a big one. It's like I said, Rothbard is very good at these kind of sweeping time periods, especially in the early part of the Great Depression. His Progressive Era and his Great Depression both cross over in the same time period to bring you into really the frame of mind you need to be to tackle someone like Roosevelt, Roosevelt II, not Teddy. Even though Teddy, it's worth bringing back up that he was somebody again who was big on picking quote unquote good and bad monopolies and cartels. But yeah, to read the quote here, Herbert Hoover fights the Great Depression. Mobilizer and economic planner of World War One, persistent advocate of cartelization and government business partnership and stabilizing industry, pioneer in promoting a pro-union outlook in industry as a method of ensuring the cooperation of labor, booster of higher wages as a sustainer of purchasing power and business prosperity, ardent proponent of massive public works and schemes during the Depression, i.e. the Hoover Dam, advocate of government programs to boost farm prices and farm co-ops, no one could have been as ideally suited as Herbert Clark Hoover to be president at the onset of the Great Depression, and to react with a radical program of statism to be trumpeted as the New Deal. And Herbert Hoover did create the New Deal. And that is precisely what Herbert Hoover did. It is one of the great ironies of historiography that the founder of every single one of the features of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was to become enshrined among historians and the general public as the last stalwart defender of laissez-faire.
Yeah, because he had almost nothing to do with it and fought against it. The last nail in the coffin, almost, would be more accurate. But yeah, he was anything but laissez-faire.
Well, there's a point he makes in the other article, which we're not going to read, but he basically just says that if there was laissez-faire, things would have been better. But in the period of 29 to 33, where employment was rising year on year, he intervened the economy for 3.5 years, very heavily, and all it did was make it worse. It made it worse by driving up prices, as we'll go into. Roosevelt made, he made it worse by doing what they doing now, is that they tried to use a lot of this to fight the natural deflation that was resultant, as he talks about, from the massive inflationary bubble that went on during the 1920s. Like Herbert Hoover was not the quote unquote do nothing president.
Far from it. Far from it. And it's the big quandary, isn't it? Is that you leave it up to Wall Street and supposedly laissez-faire economies, and as long as everyone's playing the game properly, it should work fine. But then you end up with people hiding sort of nonsense under the rug. That you end up with people cheating with shares. You end up with, kind of like we've got at the moment with meme stocks. People short stocking or shorting stocks, etc., and printing fake stocks, printing money needlessly, essentially. The government gets involved with its planning and makes the whole system worse. Is it an attempt to make it better? Is the other question. Because what you find later on down the line is that then they jump in with more regulations, more taxes, and more nonsense, and flatten everything down as much as possible. With sort of Keynesianism which is designed to lessen the bumps in both the declines and peaks, etc. Because we know that that's
Yeah,
not what
it's
it does in actual fact. It just sort of pushes the crash further on down the line. But it's a really tough one to reconcile. It really is. In an ideal environment, you would leave the market to do what it does best, which is react to the needs and requirements of the market itself. People need a spanner, someone goes and makes a spanner. The even if the requirement is not known at the time, it is recognized fairly rapidly, and that requirement is met in simple terms. You want a banana, I have a banana, I give you the banana. To sound like Hopper.
yes, good old Banana Man.
Absolutely. But when the government gets involved, they cannot help themselves but fuck it up. And then run in and become even bigger saviors of the moment and fuck it up even further, as Hoover starts to do with the New Deal. Which kind of gets everybody out of it, but in actual essence, it was the only reason it was saved was by the war happening in the 1930s. In some respects,
as it will come to, it wasn't actually saved. What happened is that the government managed to bury a lot of the losses via inflation,
yeah,
and via becoming a war economy and a further totalitarian state. There's something to be said here about the fact that there really isn't anything that can be done about the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash and any of that, because it is an invention of the unreal market. As we talked about, once we got to 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve, once they were able, in the First World War in the 1920s, to basically buy and sell debt to itself, once they were able to bring in these fiduciary media and have all these economic instruments they could use to manipulate the market rather than simply facilitating it, you ended up in this situation where the market was always going to undergo an adjustment. And either you bear the pain of the adjustment and you return back to real market economics, or what you do is you have to go further into a situation of, as we talked about last time, unreality.
Yeah.
And this is, again, the only cure within a managerial system is we'll finally be quoting Burnham directly during this stream, because it finally makes more sense, because his managerial theory was thought of in reaction to a lot of what FDR did.
Yeah.
But once you're in a managerial situation with a managed economy, the only way that you can quote unquote keep it going and improve it is to make the market less real, not more real. And you do that by essentially faking it out and brutally readjusting certain people's income and interests in regards to the greater good. But there is another, I think, source here from Rothbard, which is chapter 11 of America's Great Depression. Sorry, I got those confused on the first source. And this is page 285 in the book, and if you're reading along the PDF that the Mises Institute provides, it is page 324. But he basically lists here the fact that in 1932, Hoover said that many undertakings have been organized and forwarded during the past year to meet the new and changing emergencies. He goes on to say that he has intervened. He talks about his own intervention, and then he basically talks about his New Deal. He wants to establish a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which very much mirrors what Roosevelt would later do. Broaden the eligibility requirement for discounting at the Fed. So he wants the Fed to accelerate the economy. Create a home loan bank discount system to revive construction. So he wants to do what eventually became the Federal Housing Department, so kind of Federal Housing Association. Yeah.
Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac.
Yes.
Yes. Which
we
know those names from 2008, don't we? Because that was that crash. It was well, they were part of it anyway. But yeah, that was. If they were they actually created at that point, or was it just their predecessor?
No, they were created during the New Deal.
They were created during the New Deal, weren't they? Yeah.
Fannie Mae was, yes. Freddie Mac was created in the 70s to basically do the same role.
Yeah.
After they pretended to privatize Fannie Mae. But we did talk about that in a video on the channel a couple of weeks ago about the looming housing crisis. And there will hopefully be another upload about the COVID total state on Monday, so do look out for that. And I'm also working on more articles as well, but enough shilling. Yeah, he wanted to set up a public works administration to coordinate and expand federal public works. That's like the Triple C under FDR will come to. Do something to weaken quote-unquote destructive competition. So he wants to basically initiate monopolies. Grant direct loans of $300 million, which is a lot of money at the time, to states for relief. Reform the bankruptcy laws. Hoover also displayed anxiety to protect railroads from unregulated competition. So he again is indulging in many of the cartelization processes that make an economy no longer a market economy, and he is indulging in a lot of the works and a lot of the trappings of what would become the New Deal. I think I've just realized I've read 2 quotes in a row, Trig. So
that's okay.
Next time we get yeah.
Sure.
Next time we get to some, I think there's a couple of good Hopper quotes here that'll be good for you.
Good.
Later on, so I'll let you do your banana voice.
I can't promise I'm not gonna break into a dodgy German accent again, but I will try not to. That was fun last time.
That was very good. I enjoyed that.
There's something to be said for busting out the odd bit of German. So yeah, so after
the
odd bit of German, I got some stick for that from some German friends of mine. They were like, "We do not sound like that." It's like, really? God damn it. Anyway, yes. Oh
no, this is one you've been itching to talk about.
Yes. End of prohibition and the NFA. It's an interesting one, isn't it? The end of the prohibition era left, shall we say, certain federal agencies without anything to do, because they'd been busy chasing down the bootleggers and so on. Incidentally, the prohibition created a massive criminal class, which we've really not mentioned, but it's almost worth it because the amount of sort of popular media that is based around the American gangsters and bootlegging and Elliot Ness and the mafia of that time, all of it is because of prohibition, which only really lasted a handful of years. What is it, 5-6 years in total? Prohibition was around.
What was it, 20? It was.
Oh no,
it was longer than you think. Actually.
No, it was about 12 years, wasn't it?
Yes. It was a decade. Prohibition was around.
Yeah, can you imagine going a decade without a drink? Good lord.
13 years, but still, yeah, it was more than a decade. 20 to 33 is the Prohibition era.
That 13 years, I mean, it literally, in 13 years, in that period of time, huge amounts of wealth was created for people who would later become essentially almost political families, well, like the Kennedys, etc. Huge amounts of money involved in being created by bootlegging. And then suddenly these government agencies that were being funded rapidly to chase down and hunt down these criminal units suddenly had nothing to do. And so it was kind of needed. Something was needed to give them something to,
jobs for the boys.
Jobs for the boys. A job creation program was needed for government agencies with guns with nothing to do, and you ended up with essentially what became the ATF. and
Yes.
the illegalization of marijuana as well. Which, bear in mind, it was only in the 1930s that they made weed illegal. Up until
Yes.
then, it
It
was.
was.
I'm not
Well,
gonna
again,
go free the weed dude a lot, but it really was a case of, oh no, we've got nothing to do. All of these gangsters are legal now. Let's chase after the beatniks and the black community, and we've got a way of doing it here by making marijuana illegal. Worked a
you've got
treat.
yeah.
You got the
The
ATF.
ATF and the DEA are both they are both descendants of the organizations of prohibition.
Yes.
The DEA was given a remit, like you said, by drug illegalization, by the pivoting from prohibition is really exactly the same thing that happens with the war on drugs, which has created a massive amount of illegality and has done the same effect, but on an even wider scale, I would say. And you're right, it is worth bearing in mind that this is a great example that simply banning things doesn't work if there is demand for it. You have to let the market provide. And if you don't let the market provide, the illegal market will provide. And if it is something that is as on a wide scale harmless as alcohol and as a wide scale popular, unless it is something that the vast majority of people find morally repugnant to an extreme degree, you can't stamp that out because people don't want to do that. People don't actually want to spend their entire lives policing other people's actions. That's not how that works. And it took great effort to try and make America a dry place. There's a lot of studies that say that prohibition, quote unquote, worked, and alcohol consumption went down by 2/3 at first, but then was only down by 1/3 by the end of the period. So it was at 2/3 of the level it was when alcohol was legal. By the time you get to 32, 33, there are varying conflicting sources on that. But what happened is you had this mass rise of the black market because the actual market was being suppressed by a government, and that doesn't work. And prohibition is a great example of how that doesn't work. It's also worth bearing in mind as well that the expansion of power from prohibition never went away, as we talked about with the DEA and ATF. People got used to federalized law enforcement. The FBI really came into its own during the Prohibition era and had actually quite a lasting relationship with the mafia. Herbert Hoover himself never acknowledged the fact the mafia existed, quite famously. And it's kind of amazing how those two things fed off each other, and the FBI was able to, through its fighting of and then relationship with organized crime, become the massive US spanning organization that it is today, because before that, it didn't used to be.
I haven't even thought about this, but in a formalized manner. But I would be willing to bet the making marijuana illegal or criminalization of marijuana and the effects that had on, shall we say, the ethnic communities of the United States, and also the way that they handled it internationally as well, probably did more harm.
Oh yes, J. Edgar Hoover. Sorry, I keep mixing up J. Edgar Hoover and Herbert Hoover. There's two Hoovers, goddammit.
Two Hoovers, yes. J. Edgar Hoover was cleaning up the carpet. I mean the
yes,
America. Yeah, no, seriously though, I think marijuana and the illegalization or criminalization of that caused. I think we wouldn't have Black Lives Matter now if marijuana had been left to be legal. Because you ended up with a huge number of people being arrested and brutalized by the cops for possession. You also ended up with a huge amount of money going into certain criminal elements within that area. You ended up driving, basically, if you were black in America, it was the only way to get ahead for a while was to be a criminal, and then you would probably end up in jail. It's caused all manner of nightmares for ethnic America.
it has.
Almost more than slavery and all of the other things.
Like I said, prohibition is prohibition.
Yeah.
Like we talked about last time, that socialism is socialism.
Yeah.
You can't stop people from buying things that a large percentage of the population regards as harmless. You just can't. It's not within the government's power, and all you do is create mass amounts of human misery. But the other aspect I want to talk about, which is another make work scheme for the ATF and another, make power scheme for the security state, is there's two acts. There's the National Firearms Act, which is the one that people talk about most, and then there's the Federal Firearms Act, which is of 1938, which is actually the more impactful of the two, in my opinion. But there is some guy called Carl Fredrickson there, who was the head of the NRA. And I don't know if you want to read this, Trigg, because it's an amazing quote from the man at the head of the NRA. And then we'll get into how the NRA was involved in this, but this should frame it quite well.
Hold on. Carl Frederick, head of the NRA, 1934 to 1935. I can't find it on the actual thing, but I've got the quote here. He testified during the hearings of the National Firearms Act in 1934, saying, "I have never believed in the general practice of carrying weapons. I seldom carry one. I have when I felt it was desirable to do so for my own protection. I know that applies to most of the instances where guns are effectively in self-defense or in places of business and in the home. I do not believe in the general promiscuous toting of guns. I think they should be sharply restricted and only under licenses." That's the NRA. The National Rifle Association said that. Yeah.
Well, there's the fact that the NRA's history has been whitewashed. That the NRA was created originally as a sportsman's organization in the 1800s. But what happened in 1933 was, essentially, the federal government ended up folding it into the machinery of state. And it's one of the first things that Roosevelt did, because the political wing of the NRA was originally set up to draft anti-gun laws and to draft gun restrictions and to make sure they were done in conjunction with the industry, to basically, again, cartelize the gun industry, but neuter what the public could buy. The NFA and the FFA shouldn't be taken lightly, because since the Second Amendment, they were the only pieces of restrictions on what Americans could and couldn't own. Before that, you did not, you could buy a firearm like you could buy a broom, right up until 1934. The restrictions on Americans' rights to bear arms only started at the beginning of the New Deal era, and they only started after the subsumation of mass democracy. They only started after the mass franchise. So my theory is that Franklin Roosevelt and those who knew what they were going to do were deathly afraid of Americans owning effective weaponry. It's the first, the second guarantees all else, as a lot of people talk about. I think this is a great example of that. That right at the beginning of the New Deal era, you get a mass restriction and a mass, criminalizing of certain types of weapon. And this is completely out of line with what has gone before. It is literally unprecedented within the US.
It's unconstitutional, is what it is. The Second Amendment is designed specifically to allow for regulated militias of people and the general public to be able to go essentially toe-to-toe with the government if needed. And it was written that way because they'd only just got out of a war with the government and won to win their freedom, and they knew damn well that they needed equal equipment.
Well,
I would say that the fucking point of the Second Amendment is so you can literally delete government if need be. Like,
the NFA, and to a lesser extent, the FFA, since it came later but was slightly more impactful, are as kind of paradigm shifting as the passing of income tax was. Income tax really just makes the 10th Amendment not exist anymore. And the passing of the NFA effectively makes the Second Amendment nullified, because you have laws on the books that are continued forward to this day that clearly violate, the spirit and the letter of the Constitution. And they are put in place by, a big government that has enhanced the power of the executive branch to such a degree and neutered the power of Congress and a lot of the checks and balances by this point. Through Woodrow Wilson, and then later, as we'll get to, through the instruments that FDR brought into place. You end up with a situation where the Constitution doesn't matter. All that matters is who is wielding power at that moment. And income tax under Woodrow Wilson and the NFA under Roosevelt are the two, I think, biggest indicators of that. But they show that the sacred principles, supposedly the founding fathers, are openly able to be disregarded by people who accrue enough executive power.
Bloody disgraceful, frankly. Yes.
Very quickly, before we move on, I just want to talk about the Federal Firearms Act. That is what imposed federal FFL licenses on gun manufacturers, importers, and persons in business selling firearms. It also basically came up with the background checks, and it also meant that people who were mentally disabled or had criminal records couldn't buy guns. That's what I mean by it's actually more impactful than the NFA, because it is what made a firearm so much more different, even a normal like single shot shotgun, so much more different than any other item that you would buy at that time. It made it even more, it made it even worse to buy than alcohol that had just been legalized. It made it even worse to buy than certain things that were considered distasteful. It was more restricted at this point because the FCC didn't exist than things like pornographic films to a degree. But that's debatable because stuff hadn't really caught up with that. But it does really create firearms as their own class of restricted item, as opposed to simply quote unquote NFA items, and then the rest of them being completely legal like a broom. So again, it's a very, very impactful piece of legislation.
Still do a lot of damage with a broom. And you know what? This is the other thing: is knives. And I'm not saying, good God, do not fucking come for my knives. In England, they already have. You can't go outside with a freaking pen knife of over 2 inches long. It's nonsense. But knife attacks kill far more people in America than gun attacks do. It's like 4 times more. It is even then. It is a matter of, oh no, these are dangerous for us in power. That's the problem, that they are afraid of guns because anyone can have one and go, nah, I'm getting rid of you, mate. And they knew damn well that they were going to do things that I believe personally that they knew damn well that them and future governments will be doing things that people would find abhorrent and might end up needing to disarm the populace.
Oh, just had a new member there. Thank you for joining, Caleb Bluefire. They've joined as a Venus Bro, so thank you for your Venus Broship.
Everyone's a Venus Bro.
Yes, but before we get too long in the tooth here, there is we need to talk about Britain, because the interwar period in Britain. There's a great book called Britain Between the Wars. It doesn't have exactly the same kind of historiographical outlook that things like Rothbard do, and so I've not used it very much. There's a couple of quotes here and there that I've used in previous streams, specifically about unemployment insurance. But it is one of the only decent sources I can find about interwar Britain, because interwar Britain is so glossed over because it doesn't make sense within the mainstream historical narrative. Interwar Britain is one of the biggest hat tips that Britain has never, it never became a quote-unquote democracy after the mass franchise was given, because you have this period here that's known as national government. I don't know, how aware of this are you, Trig? Because I have to do a lot of research through this segment.
I'm, not as well as I could be. I do know that led to the rise of a certain Mr. Oswald Mosley, who had some very interesting ideas, and maybe named himself and his organisation a little ill-advisedly, shall we say? But not all of his ideas were great, but there's something to be said for reading what he had to say on a couple of things. He's quite an interesting chap.
He is, and I wanted to include some more about him and the fact that basically all the suffragettes either became communists or fascists.
Or fascists, yes, I know. That's very interesting, that is, isn't it?
Do look it up. Do Google fascist suffragettes, because like the vast majority of them actually joined the British League of Fascists. It's really amazing to see that. It also reveals the fact that, as we talked about when we talked about the earlier time period, the suffragettes were really just a bunch of niche activist weirdos from the upper middle, and upper classes of the UK, and that they did not represent mass opinion at all. People were not actually that worried about quote unquote democracy. They were more worried about their own lives, their own jobs, their own incomes in their own areas. There was not this real mass popular push for more voting. The suffragettes were, as is evidenced by the fact that they became fascists and communists, a whole bunch of really niche political extremists who were used as, again, an excuse to enact legislation that would eventually just benefit the parliamentarians. So that's the very abridged version of that section here. And Oswald Mosley was quite similar to what we talked about with Hitler, in that he actually saw himself as more democratic. He saw, liberal democracy as a paralyzing force, but, fascist will of the people democracy as a liberating force that cut through all the red tape. But again,
I was going to say, he's a very big advocate for upstanding, sort of Paragon-esque people to stand forwards and be good role models, which you don't see that very often these days. You don't. There's something to be said. I'm far from advocating his ideas, and good God, they wouldn't work in a modern day society. But I do think he was treated a little harshly at the times. Certainly the way he was basically thrown in jail for no particular reason whatsoever seemed a little off.
Oswald Mosley was only really proposing, as in the early years, as Hitler was proposing, economically exactly the same as what FDR went on to do.
Yeah.
Mosley only differed in that he wasn't as extreme as Hitler was socially, and in terms of what needs to be done. He was someone who synthesized the ideas of British nationalism and socialism. It's there in the name, and that's what he did. But again, I cut a lot of that out of my notes for the first draft because we don't have time to talk about that, unfortunately.
We maybe something to talk about at another point in time. It's a difficult one because I don't want to be sort of seen as someone that's waving the flag for people like this, but I do think it's worth talking about because they never get talked about. Nobody ever reads the books. It's just fascists equal bad, and it's but I don't want to be the guy that go, well, it's actually nuanced, but there is something that's worth. These people had a lot of people following them. They had, they did inspire a lot of people. It's worth looking at and looking at why they did. I think in detail at some point, perhaps. But yes, shall we move on? Because I know there's a nice you got what's that? Find My Past, the national.
It's actually one of the only good kind of non-academic and nice summations that isn't behind a paywall of the national government of the 30s is actually on findmypast.com. Weirdly enough, it's the only one I could find that really showed what I wanted to show people, in that the 1930s entirely is a period of coalition governments.
Yes.
It seems amazing when you talk about it now, but there was not a majority government in Britain from the collapse of the Liberal government during World War I and the Labour government in 1945. There was not a majority government. They were all national governments, coalition governments of some variety, and they managed to get their quote unquote majority by essentially bundling all the political parties into one. There was a minority Labour government, as we talked about last time, under Ramsay MacDonald in the 1920s, after the collapse of the Liberal coalition that was then taken over by the Conservatives. But that fell apart. They never had a majority in Parliament. They won the most votes, but they never had an absolute majority in Parliament. So they were a minority government, and eventually Ramsay MacDonald formed what was called National Labour. But the national government, in quotes, went on throughout the time period. It really did. It was something that just kept going, and I think it was really to mimic the governance during World War I that they felt worked, because they didn't know what else to do in a crisis. but it shows what a farce the supposedly adversarial system was.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think about that now, especially because England has seen one coalition government in my lifetime, and that's some 40 years, and that was Nick Clegg and Cameron, and frankly, Nick Clegg was basically the D-boy in that relationship.
Yes.
Whereas this was actually sort of, I don't want to say strong coalition government. It was. It's more that all the parties seem to be singing the same tune, which in and of its own right is somewhat conservative. I mean, or concerning rather. The national government. Vote for the national government. It doesn't matter who you vote for. You're going to get the same government. It's a little worrying about whether or not that democracy is working as it should do in that point in time. But
Look at the difference just a year later, because there's two posters I put in there.
Yeah.
There's Ramsay MacDonald's, the man for peace and security and progress, and I think that's Bona Law actually. Sorry, but that's the rest of the national government. But there's a Labour poster here from 1929 which says, "Men and women, workers, your chance at last. Vote Labour in your own interest." And it's amazing how open that is about people voting to enrich themselves, as we talked about repeatedly. But there's actually quite a bit to talk about in this section, so I do want to go on with it. There's a really good footnote, actually, in Democracy, the God That Failed, which talks about the amount of people who can vote. It actually follows on from a quote that we've used previously. It talks about one world government, basically. This is chapter 4 on democracy, redistribution, and destruction of property, page 95 or 121 if you're following on the PDF. But it says, with these thought experiments in mind, he's talking about the one world government and it being ruled by India and China. There can be no doubt that the consequences which resulted from the process of democratization that began in Europe and the US in the second half of the 19th century and came to fruition since the end of the Second World War, the successive expansion of the franchise, and finally the establishment of universal adult suffrage did within each country what a world democracy would do for the entire globe. It set in motion a seemingly permanent tendency towards wealth and income redistribution. One man, one vote combined with free entry into government democracy implies that every person and his personal property comes within reach and is up for grabs by everyone else. A tragedy of the commons is created. I think we've talked about that before. But there's a little footnote 3 here, and he talks about the fact that as a rough indicator of this tendency, one might want to relate successive expansions of the electorate during the late 19th and early 20th century to the rise of socialism and social democratic voter turnout, and the parallel decline of liberal parties. A few examples here will suffice. 1. Germany, for the years 1871, 1903, and 1919. The total number of votes cast were 1.4, 9.5, and 30.5 million, respectively. The socialist voter turnout was 3, 32, and 46%. The liberal voter turnout was 46, 22, and 22%, respectively. Italy, for the years 1895, 1913, 1919, 1.1 million, 5.1 million, and 5.8 million. And the socialist voter turnout went from 7, 18 to 32. What it shows is that when you have a state in which all adults can vote, you very quickly end up with a coalition of people who are voting to take away the possessions of the people they don't like. And the hodgepodge of governments that was had in the 1930s in Britain is a great example of both the desire for socialism and the fear of socialism driving power into the hands of the elites, which basically became a more than 2 decades spanning technocratic government. You had technocratic government in one form or another from the middle of the First World War to the end of the Second World War in Britain. And that is what people don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about the fact that the mass enfranchisement of the population led to what was essentially political chaos in which the elites decided to band together in order to become, the national government. There was no other government. Britain was essentially, between the First World War and the Second World War, a one-party state because of the rise of Labour and its later bringing into the establishment. it's amazing here as well that you see that Labour is moved from a radical trade union organization and a Marxist organization into an aspect of the British establishment that takes part in these national governments. They essentially become another spoke of the wheel. It's kind of amazing. There's a lot else here as well.
Yeah.
In 1931, a unified unemployment system was brought into place, which pays out not according to contribution, but basically each according to his need. And that reveals the fact that unemployment insurance isn't really an insurance, it's a blanket benefit. It is purely wealth redistribution. Again, there's another great quote here from Hopper in The Great Fiction. He goes onto a bridge a bit of what Mises said. If you want to read this one, Trig.
This is part 11, isn't it, or point 11?
Yeah, this is part 11.
Yes.
This is really rather good.
For one of the earliest, most profound, and most far-sighted analysis of this, see Mises Socialism, page 429 to 32. And 438 to 41. Writing in the early 1920s, Mises described the effects of social insurance as follows: by weakening or completely destroying the will to be well and able to work, social insurance creates illness and inability to work. It produces the habit of complaining. In short, it is the institution which tends to encourage disease, not to say accidents, and to intensify considerably the physical and psychic results of accidents and illnesses. As a social institution, it makes people sick bodily and mentally, or at least helps to multiply, lengthen, and intensify disease. Moreover, Mises proceeds to the heart of the matter and explains why insurance against most health and accident risks, and in particular the risk of unemployment, is economically impossible. The value of health and accident insurance becomes problematic by reason of the possibility that the insured person may himself bring about or at least intensify the condition insured against. But in the case of employment insurance, the condition insured against can never develop unless the insured person's so well unemployment is a problem of the wages, not work. It is just as impossible to insure against the unemployment as it would be to insure against, say, the unsaleability of commodities. Employment and unemployment insurance is definitely a misnomer. There can never be a statistical foundation for such an insurance. So in other words, if you start insuring people against unemployment, they start not feeling like working. Essentially, to say it against the unsaleability of commodities is to insure someone's shop in case they don't sell their goods and services, so that they basically decide not to open the shop because they get paid anyway. You're incentivizing them to sit on their fat arse and watch TV, essentially, which we do see a fair amount of that happening these days.
Yes, we do.
He says as he pours himself another beer.
Well, it's true. A lot of people are. Well, it also forces certain people into it, and it makes work less viable.
It does. It certainly does.
Basically, this is Mises describing the benefits trap in the 1940s, which is quite amazing foresight. He's talking about something that really came into fruition in America and in the UK in the 1980s.
Oh yeah,
in many places.
I've seen this with my own eyes. My mum, for a start, was back in the 80s was a personnel director, and she would have people coming in and going, "Hi, I really want to work this, that, and the other. All these qualifications, yes." And she'd go, "Great, you can start, and you'll be being paid." I mean, we're talking about the 80s, so it was probably about sort of 7,000 a year or whatever. And they would go, "No, I can't pay that. I can't be paid that. I get more than that off the state. You're going to have to pay me 12 grand. So, well, I'm terribly sorry. This job doesn't pay 12 grand. And they go, well, terribly sorry, I can't work for you in that case. And off they would go. And who can blame them if they're getting 12 grand for essentially shining the seat of their sofa because of, unemployment benefit and, childcare and various other bits and bobs that they will lose should they get a job You're telling somebody to get out of bed early, do a hard day's work, etc., and come home for less than they would get for not doing anything. You're incentivizing them against working, and whilst you can tell them yes, but you'll get a step up the ladder, and you'll in 2 years' time you'll be earning twice that. It's very, very difficult to incentivize, and yeah, they might, but getting people off that bottom rung becomes almost an impossibility. The amount of times I used to work, I would place people on minimum wage. I did a recruitment agency work a long time ago, and the only people we could get to go and work in literally cabbage fields. They were needed to be up at 4 in the morning and on a bus to get into a cabbage field at the crack of dawn and pick cabbages and sort them. And it was a full day's work, and they'd get home by 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, or maybe even later, after earning basically minimum wage. And a lot of people were just like, no, I basically get that from being on the dole. Why should I work all day for nothing? So instead, you ended up with Polish people coming over, and they weren't on the dole. They couldn't claim dole, so they would do these jobs, and which is why you now hear people, oh well, English people wouldn't take those jobs. English people wouldn't take a job working in Pretz. It's only Australian people on a gap year that take those jobs. Well, yes, because the English people are being incentivized to sit on their fat asses because an employment benefit does this for you. It is a way to cripple the employment or the employability of a generation of people. And then because they've got no employment history, they don't get the decent jobs that pay more.
Well, this is all happening in 1931.
Yeah.
Which is referred to as by many the tragic year for many reasons. Because it's the year that unemployment really does start to bite horrendously. It's also the reason that in both the year in both the US and the UK go into full overdrive in implementing certain things. It's 31 in the UK and 33 a lot of the time in the US. But you have these two banner years. In 31, you have, like I said, unified unemployment insurance pays out, and it's not a contributory system anymore. It's no longer even illusionary an insurance, as we talked about. But in 1931, as we'll get to later, there's the suspension of the gold standard. I don't want to talk about the whole gold standard suspension in full because it's a much better discussion when we get to 33 in the US, and the Fed suspends the gold standard. But the UK defending the gold standard was really an admission of defeat because the 29 and 30, elections have been fought because the Labour government was brought down by a lot of the questions of the gold standard and their economic record. In fact, the 1929 and 30 elections were fought on saving the gold standard. Mm. But what happened in 31 is that Britain they had to abandon the gold standard. And there's a quick quote here from Rothbard's Great Depression. I'm not going to go to the page, but he just says, there is no need to dwell on the international difficulties that piled up in Europe in the last 1931, finally leading Germany, England, and most other European countries to renounce their obligations and go off the gold standard. They all did it all at once. And it was because they could not continue the charade without devaluing their currencies. Britain humiliated as it was with, I think we talked about this last time as well, not last time, but in the 1920s stream about the Statute of Westminster, when basically they announced that the empire essentially no longer exists and it's the Commonwealth because New Zealand becomes independent, Canada gets a greater degree of autonomy, so does Australia, and so do a lot of the dependencies.
Canada got the autonomy because they basically had the balls to take it. They turned around and went, no, yes, we're not getting involved in your stupid wars anymore. And England went, oh, okay then, which was pathetic. But yeah, I mean, well done to them, to be honest.
The Statute of Westminster, again, 1931. So in 1931, Britain essentially brought in a communist welfare system. They suspended the gold standard, and they lost direct influence over large chunks of the empire. It was a humiliation of Britain, and Britain really was having to acknowledge the fact that it had been smashed by it lost the First World War. But that's the result is just the humiliating devaluation of the pound. And it was, it's celebrated. It's seen as the right thing to do. But again, its results were quite disastrous. You also have, during the 1930s, the Incitement of Disaffection Act, which basically means that you can't encourage current or former military officers to criticize the crown or criticize the government.
No.
And the bigger one, which still gets used to this day, which is the Public Order Act, which was squarely aimed at political opponents, like the British League of Fascists. It makes wearing political uniforms in public illegal. The Public Order Act is the act that makes you have to register every single protest with the police. People take that as a given today, but 1936, the national government that had been in place for 5 years at that point effectively said, right, if you want to protest, this has to be given permission by the police. Basically, it turns all non-broken up protests into state-endorsed protests, and they are to this day, as I keep talking about, because of the Public Order Act. It makes a whole bunch of public criticism a crime. The people who were charged for chasing down the BBC journalist were charged under public order offences. It is the most common thing that people will be charged at a protest, because it's such a sweeping piece of legislation. That really is part of the, Britain is becoming a one-party police state in many ways during this period.
Hasn't really changed an awful lot since, to be perfectly honest. I mean, no. It tries to pretend it's not, but try criticizing COVID. Try going out for a walk in the blooming. Try criticizing the government last year. I mean, it's okay if you've got the Black Lives Matter banner. They'll let you go and tear down whatever statue you like then, essentially. I mean, they might kick off a bit if you get too rowdy. But start talking about, releasing lockdowns for COVID, and oh boy did they come in baton swinging. Yeah.
All this really shows altogether is it's the reality of a political system that has been taken over by managerialists. Because yes. You've had a group of people who have been sold the false prosperity of the 20s and then panicked when the 30s hit. When the Wall Street crash happened, the unemployment points. And they're just turning to the establishment and going, please save us. And these political parties that are supposed to be adversarial become interchangeable and indistinguishable when they need to retain power. You have a cycle of chaos and consolidation. And you have a lot of the false neutrality of these institutions that are set up. This is just the way the country's governed. That is the logic in place there. And all sides of the political debate, promise managerialism. There's no one who is saying that they are going to reduce the size of the government during this period. There is the Conservatives saying we're going to provide limits on socialism, which is then basically openly saying that they are socialism with speed limits. But no one is offering anything outside of mass state intervention and the just reeling pragmatic responses you get from crisis after crisis after crisis, from Britain going from a global superpower to a collapsing state.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it really was. It was the beginnings of it then. It was held off a little through the war period. But good God, it wasn't until the 80s that England started recovering from being a collapsing state. It really wasn't.
We're running a little bit long here, so we might have to skim over this one a little bit.
Well, okay. I will say he does look rather dashing in that.
He does.
But
I don't know, Trig, is this something you've factored into all of this? What happened with the royals during these periods?
What happened in the royals in this period? I mean, to be honest, I think, bearing in mind that the royal family had just watched the massacre of a fair old chunk of its own family in Russia. Yes. Because bear in mind, the Tsars, George and Tsar Nicholas were spitting images. As kids, they used to dress up in each other's clothes and confuse the royal sort of household members because no one knew which ones they were. This was a family that had just gone through a terrible terrible loss. The Tsars had been sacrificed on the altar of socialism, and part of me actually thinks that at this time they were just keeping their heads down lest they be next. And I think they're still there, to be honest. I really don't think that the crown in England really has recovered from the sacrifice of the Tsars. And it's been sat there waiting very, very quietly, going, we're going to keep our heads down, we're just going to nod, we're going to rubber stamp everything that comes our way, just in case these bunch of socialists decide to fucking put us against the wall and butcher us. Because
yes,
it
not
really...
to mention Wilhelm, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. After the war, he was in exile, wasn't he? He wasn't... Was he?
Yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't in exile. He was in exile in the Netherlands. But what really happened was that Versailles and a lot of the American-led efforts there to, as we talked about during the stream on the consequence of the First World War, to replace all what they saw as autocracy with American-style democracy, it ended up as a kind of a war on monarchy and aristocracy that was headed up by Woodrow Wilson. And you're right, the result of that was, the American and British sponsorship of the Russian Revolution, as we saw with Sutton's work. And that was led into by the big thing here is the abdication crisis. I'm sure it's one of the few things people know about the interwar period, which was the abdication of Edward VIII.
Yes.
Yes. It was Edward VII. Yeah,
Edward VII. See, this is what happens when royal family members of the British royal family get involved with American actresses.
It is Edward VIII.
Yeah. It's another case of I mean, we are seeing it happening all over again at the moment. I mean, it's slightly different politics ish, but yeah, all over again. Royal family gets mixed up with American socialite / actress, and it all goes horribly wrong for them, and they have to abdicate. Not that Harry really is exactly a...
There's one link here I want to get up that's actually from the National Archives. But all it demonstrates is that it's a point of historical fact that Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, along with
Edward VII.
George V before he died, had been part of the crowd of people who had told Edward VIII basically to wind his neck in and stop being a womanizer. But when the abdication crisis happened, when Edward VIII tried to marry the multiple divorcee American, famously.
Mm-hmm.
What was her name again?
Mary Simpson. Oh, sorry, Wallace Simpson. Yes.
Yeah, Wallace Simpson, that's it. It just went out of my head as soon as I went to it.
Yeah,
he tried to marry Wallace Simpson, who was a multiple divorcee. And the crisis was, as head of the Church of England, technically, Edward VIII couldn't violate the policy of, remarrying after divorce. They frowned upon that, especially multiple divorces. So she was basically a scandalous multiple divorcee, and he was a feckless womanizer. And that led to his downfall. But it was amazing that Stanley Baldwin was able to place before Edward the choice between the throne and his proposed marriage. He basically told Edward to change his behavior or abdicate. And that's an amazing demonstration of power by a prime minister. It's an amazing demonstration of the fact that Parliament, not the royals, are in control, and they are the real heads of state. And the British crown took a long time to recover from the abdication crisis. George VI only called himself George VI for continuity reasons. That was never his name. He was called Albert because of Victoria and Albert. But he went on to try and rehabilitate some of the image of the crown. But during this period, George VI himself, even though he's lionized as seeing Britain through the Second World War, was a very weak personality. He was never groomed to be in power. He was a anxious, stuttering mess and quite a weak, timid man. He was not a man to lead. And the 1-2 punch of the abdication crisis and the timid personality of George VI meant that the British Crown could really exert no control during this period.
No.
The parliamentarians were able to fully exploit their position. And as we talked about before, the House of Lords had basically been eliminated. So the Lords was traditionally how the king exercised power over Parliament, because the Lords sweared fealty to him, but that system had disappeared. Nothing had replaced it.
No, and I mean George went on to it was Queen. It was Queenie after that, wasn't it? It was Elizabeth. Now she, to her credit, she's been a hell of a monarch, in that she's been a hell of a diplomat. But she's never actually sort of disagreed with Parliament at all. She's occasionally gotten rather miffed with Parliament, and occasionally sort of said, "Well, actually, I don't feel like knighting Tony Blair, so no, I'm not going to touch his neck with a sword unless I can swing it properly." Essentially. I don't think she actually said that. I am putting those words in her mouth, but she has not done what is normally done, shall we say, for prime ministers, and it's the Order of the Garter, isn't it? They normally get, but yeah, no, she's She has been a rare sort of wallflower, in that she's been very, very beautiful, very, very stately, and so on, but not done an awful lot. What's this? Holy Christ, it was worse. Yeah. Yes. Hi, Daconia. Dacorona. Sorry. Yeah. We had a we have had a very distinct deficit of monarch in the 20th century. I portrait. I wish she had. I hope she has. I wouldn't put it past her. She seems like an interesting person. She has always been very, very quiet and known what to say. But yes. I know she did not like Tony Blair, or does not like Tony Blair, or Gordon Brown.
The last point to be made before we move on, again, we need to get going. Maybe gloss over this next point a little bit as well.
Go on.
Because we need to talk about FDR.
Am I waffling?
We have so much to say about it.
Yeah. Because yes.
You're not waffling. No, I'm keeping an eye on the time. The only other point is a point we've made before, in that both Hopper and the guy who wrote Equality and Liberty with the unpronounceable name, Cupid Ledden or whatever his name is.
Yes.
They both talk very handily about how aristocracy handles war versus how total states handle war, and the complete decline of any vestige of royal British power during the First World War, and during the interwar period becoming even more ineffectual and no chance of resurgence happening, really codifies the fact that this is how Britain's wars will be fought. There is no aristocracy anymore to say we're not doing that. No. There is no sense of the king really anymore. The royal family is an embarrassment during the abdication crisis, and it takes quite a long time for George VI to bring that reputation back around. It's only when the Second World War hits and they have to use him as a false sense of patriotism, really, that his reputation of the royal family comes back around. You have got a situation in which the British state, as defined by Lloyd George and then by Winston Churchill, because he was there, as we've talked about earlier, right through the period, right through the 1910s, is unopposed. There is no British power. You went from 1902, Queen Victoria, Empress of India. You went from the very, very powerful rule of a global conquering monarch, and within 30 years, you've got the abdication crisis. And the difference in power there, I think, directly relates to how Britain and the rest of Europe fight their wars. And that is a point that has been made previously, though, and is quite heavily elucidated in both Harper and in Liberty and Equality.
Yes.
I think the next thing we need to talk about is why we don't actually talk about the British Conservatives, the Republican Party, or kind of conservatism in general.
Well,
Um,
what does
they're
it?
strangely absent from this series, in
What
case
does
you
it?
haven't
What
noticed.
does it mean? What are conservatives? What are they conserving? Are they? Are they?
Yes.
Are they? Oh no! Let's look after the plants. Are they? Are they conserving anything? No, no. It's conservative in name only. It is really just let's listen to the left wing, see what good ideas they happen to have or bad ideas they happen to have, and then try and slow it down a bit. Just generally seems to be the by and large of it. There have been occasional conservative governments that have had other ideas, shall we say. Um, they have been popular for a while and then unpopular afterwards. Cough, cough, Margaret Thatcher, cough. But other than that, they're pretty much a slightly fluffy version, very popular. I mean, if you look at the history of voting, Conservatives are the only party that ever really gets into power in the last 100 years in England, with occasional blips of Labour. But by and large, it is the Conservative government. But we don't talk about them very much because they don't stand for anything. I think
Well,
is
it's the timidity, really. It's the
yeah.
deliberate timidity. It's the deliberate holding pattern.
Mm.
And it really is. The British Conservative Party is responsible for the shape of Britain. It is the default party of power, and it really just belies the slow exercise of that power. Like both in the UK and the US, the period of Republican and Conservative government represent holding patterns in terms of policy, but continuity of power and policy within the institutions. Like you've talked about before, the civil service remains the same.
Yeah. Yes, Sir Humphrey never changes. Seriously, anybody that hasn't watched Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister, you really should. That is British politics to a T, wonderfully put for the last 100 years at least, and really hasn't changed up until now, as far as I can tell.
Well, yes, we quoted Hopper earlier about the power of people to enrich themselves, but that also gives managerialists a great amount of power, and
Yes.
the public voting to enrich themselves doesn't enrich the public because quote unquote public goods and public property aren't administered by them. I'll return to this point in a bit more detail right at the end when we talk about who benefits from this. But the Conservatives never really row back. They never really reduce the size of the state.
No.
As we've been over it quite a few times. I should have put it in the links. I don't know if you still have it anywhere, Trig. But the graph of taxation that we always bring up, of that it comes up and plateaus, it comes up and plateaus. It never really, apart from minor fluctuations, falls back down as a percent of GDP. And those flattening periods you see are the periods of quote unquote conservative governments. They are a pause on the march of the left, but they never, ever reverse it.
They're almost more insidious than that, though. It's not just a pause. What the Conservative government do tend to do is one thing they will do is they will spend money often. Not so much recently, actually, but more often than not, they'll spend money on increasing money to the police. They will increase policing. They want to be the party of law and order. Under the Conservative government, we'll make sure that the crime rate will drop, and we'll put, etc., etc. And so you get a spike of change from a Labour government, and then it all gets a bit rowdy. And then the Conservatives come in, and the police come in, and new boot literally comes in and stamps on everything and squashes it into place, and everyone goes, "Oh yes, it's good to see a Conservative government back in them." It's look, party of law and order. It's all calm again, and then it's time for a change again, and we get a bit of Labour, and it all goes horribly wrong again. And no, I have no idea where the hell these things. I'm sure I had them. Is it in here? No. Bloody hell.
What's that, sorry?
I'm trying to find the taxation spending.
It doesn't. We've had it up quite a few times, but the upshot of it is the amount of tax taken out of the economy has not reduced in a meaningful way since 1900, and it has fluctuated generally in the US between a maximum of 25 to 30%, and in the UK as between a maximum of 35 to 40%. And it never moves outside of those limits. It's stabilized like that after the Second World War. But the period we see here, especially interwar years, is a big fluctuation. It's a bit more wild in terms of ups and downs, but it's especially in the US a general uptrend, and quite a steep uptrend in the US, of taxation income. The size of the government, in terms of how much money it takes out of the economy, consistently increases, both in the US and the UK, even though the UK, for most of this period, has a supposedly quote-unquote conservative coalition government.
Here we go. Hold on, I found it. I would have text somewhere to moan about. I mean, there's that big spike in the 1920s to 1940s period, and then after that, yeah, it's by and large the same.
But I think what they figure out the kind of the rough amount of money they can take out of the economy before the thing goes pop, basically. You start to see that they stabilize on the acceptable cycle limits of how much money they can steal from people.
They get their hands just 30% of the way into your pocket. They know if they go all the way down and dig right down and grab you by the short and curlies, you're gonna scream and shout about it. But just in a little bit, just the tip, so to speak, and no one really complains too much, apparently. Sorry.
Bear in mind, this is revenue, and the reason that revenue in the UK is falling is because of how much prestige and imperial stuff that the UK is losing during this period too. The taxation rates actually increase during this period, but the revenues don't because of how dire the economic situation is. But it's, as you can see, the Conservative government never meaningfully reduces it. They still end up at crisis level World War I spending, and you see how far it spikes above everyone else because of how much they had to tax people for World War I. That's why it's level. In fact, the US only just about catches up with us when it gets to the end of the 1930s, because our taxation has been so high for so long, and that is what conservatism looks like. That is the graph of conservatism. Massive leaps in spending in times of crisis, and then a managed period where the institutions remain as they are, the size of the state remains as it is, and nothing effectively changes. In a wider sense, they're the elites who make the leftist systems workable and act as their guardians. If they don't row it back, they must see value in it. If they don't row back the spending of the First World War, they don't row back the socialistic spending of the Labour Party, that must be what they want. No matter what their actual rhetoric is, they act as the guardians of this system. They are its protectors because they pretend to make it more efficient and they pretend to make it more workable, but all they do is solidify it in place. They are actually the parties of consolidation. And then they use the leftist parties as a way to increase the size of other parts of the state. But then they only ever consolidate and pause. They never row back. And that's plainly evidenced by this graph.
Yeah. I certainly never rolled it back after the 1940s. Good God, look at that jump. Ugh.
Well, again, we'll get onto that because
we're jumping ahead at that point, but ugh.
A big yuck. The only other point I would make, there's a quick link here, which we probably don't even need to get up, but there's a little mainstream source that I found.
I can.
He's Hillside College Churchill Project. He's a writer and historian. It's Richard M. Langworth. Because I'm trying to, I've struggled to find a lot of mainstream interwar sources, especially in the 1930s, because it is an embarrassing period in British history. But the piece is called Consistency, Politics Before Country, and this is part 2. But basically what he says is that Stanley Baldwin, who was the leader of the Conservative Party and the national government before Neville Chamberlain, who famously did the policy of appeasement, didn't want to rearm because the public didn't want to rearm. And this is seen as a failure. And it's a curious piece, this. Because basically what it says is that if you believe you are right, you should, even though you're a politician supposedly beholden to the public, if you have a grand vision and, it's almost like a retrospect. It's like, well, in retrospect, Churchill was right. So Baldwin is seen as this timid idiot. But really what's happening is that Baldwin is rearming as fast as he can, whilst the public isn't noticing it. They won't openly embrace a policy of rearmament because the British public would actually go into revolt. The British public during this period does not want war. They are extremely determined to maintain peace and not get involved in outside affairs like what happened in the First World War. They still see that as a failing.
Well, they were right. This is why Mosley was getting so popular. Was he was there going, no, we do not need another war in Europe. We do not need to be involved in one. Let's not, at all costs, get involved in one. And as a result, got a lot of support from people. Was he right? Was he wrong? Well, that's another question. But yes, you say that we the people of 1930s did not want another war. The First World War was horrendous. Just about every single family in England had lost somebody. Every single girl had lost their brother or their dad or at least their uncle in this horrendous meat grinder that had been the First World War. That no one could actually understand why they'd been dragged into it in the first place anyway.
Again, it is amazing that there's this elasticity within how democracy is talked about by politicians, that the public is at the same time sacred and stupid, that the public will is at the same time, absolute, and at the same time it is completely disregardable, depending on the situation. And historically, it doesn't really make any sense. And rhetorically and ideologically, it doesn't make any sense either. It's basically a view of history which says the right thing to do is what the eventual victors wanted to do. It's a very, one, deterministic view of history, and two, an extremely backwards view of history. It is history as written by the victors by design. Because it's, knowing the outcomes we did, and, because the eventual victors did this, it's very much that logic. And most mainstream history is just built on that. It's built on the fact that they are assessing the outcomes from a modern perspective. They are not looking at the actual factors as they appear in the time period, as we're trying to do. We can talk about where things go eventually, but that's why we try not to move too far outside the time periods we're in. Yeah. Because you have to talk about the logic of the day. You have to put yourself in the mindset of the day, and you have to look, you can look at the actual outcomes from how they did happen in retrospect in terms of the truth, but you can't just go through and say, here's what happened, therefore what happened was meant to happen, and what was done here was right. That is a simplistic logic of a lot of what is said about someone like Churchill, and that really isn't the simplistic logic about anyone of the supposedly conservative figures who step outside of the miasma of conservatism and enhance the size and power of the state in some way, or move towards what the international narrative or international, basically what the globalists of the period want to do. They are the only conservatives who end up being lionized. The rest of them really are forgotten by history. They end up being regarded as laissez-faire enthusiasts like Hoover, or as timid appeasers like Baldwin and Chamberlain. Chamberlain
really was rather weak, but yes. Sorry, Skog said something wonderful about that conservative. Is a little conservatives are like conserving an ancient forest as a series of rather tacky furniture. And
basically,
that's beautifully put, mate. Beautifully put. In fact, Skog, pop by sometime. We need to chat, dude. I haven't spoken to you in ages.
Yes. Please do.
It's... Yes, Chamberlain was very weak, though. Chamberlain was very weak. When did Chamberlain get into power? It was mid-30s, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
So I have in my hand a piece of paper that
that's what the thumbnail is. I have Neville Chamberlain holding a fistful of dollars is the thumbnail for this. But 37-40.
Did he make it? Of course he did make it to 40. It was because yes.
And, yeah, he ended up as the head of the war coalition at first.
Yes,
But yeah,
peace in our time. I have spoken to Mr. Hitler, and he's a very, very amiable chap. He signed this piece of
well,
paper to say that we're not. Oh no, he's invaded Poland.
as
Wrong.
as we talked about during the totalitarian special stream,
Yes.
Hitler was our guy.
Oh yeah.
And Hitler was America's guy, really.
Yeah.
He was seen as a glorious savior of the sick man of Europe that was Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of appeasement. Lloyd George extolled the virtues of him in I Spoke to Hitler.
Yes.
He was not someone, until 39, really, who was massively propagandized against. There was quite a favorable outlook to him. They were trying to bring him into the internationalist fold, really. If Hitler had played ball more, they would have treated him more like Uncle Joe Stalin. It would have been Uncle Adolf and Uncle Joe, basically, if they decided to, play ball in the Let's Rule the World Club.
Look at them with their funny moustaches. Oh, he looks like Charlie Chaplin. He's a friendly one, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't mention the Jews.
Don't mention the Jews.
He gets a bit funny about that, but other than that, he's a lovely guy. Yeah. Yes. Oof. Yeah. No, you're right. They loved him. He bang on the economic policy. Loved the economic policy of borrowing money and then inflating it away. He was more Keynesianist than Keynes was. I mean, he did turn out to somewhat turn his back on everything, but until that the Poland incident, as you say, he was very much everyone was very, very happy with him. And applauded him for his ingenuity on how he'd managed to make quite an interesting army out of even whilst sticking to the agreements of the Treaty of Versailles, etc.
Well, I'm afraid, Trig, it's time we tackle the real big topic of this stream, because we're only really halfway through here.
Aha. The yes.
I'm going to have to quickly grab some water and stuff, so I will let you talk about and introduce FDR.
FDR, indeed. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Where to start? I think, Sutton. Sutton has done so much great work that we've been referencing quite heavily. In this, and I'm going to jump straight in because he did not only did he do Hitler on Wall Street and Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, but he also did Wall Street and FDR. Anthony Sutton needs people should read his work, and I'm amazed that I didn't even know about him until starting this project, essentially. And we've got a great little quote, if I can find it. Chapter page 153 in the PDF. This one is on voltairenet.org. At the first meeting of the cabinet after the president took office in 1933, the financier and advisor to Roosevelt, Bernard Baruch, and Baruch's friend General Hugh Johnson, who had become the head of the National Recovery Administration, came in with a copy of a book by Gentile, the Italian fascist theoretician, for each member of the cabinet. And we all read it with great care. Somewhat of a fan of the fascist theory. It's worth recalling, at this point in the epigraph to Chapter 1, that Franklin D. Roosevelt privately believed that the US government was owned by a financial elite. There is, of course, nothing notably original about this observation. In fact, I've rambled on that the government in America is, yes, very definitely the possession of a fascist, of a financial elite.
God, that quote though about the fact that he's handing out fascist literature to the cabinet is amazing.
I know. It's great, isn't it? So yeah, FDR being, oh no, he's original. No. He was somewhat of a fan of Italian redrawing of the of the Roman Republic as a
Yeah, well,
slightly mangled cat.
we'll get to that exact chapter in Wall Street and the rise of FDR. Well, it's just called Wall Street and FDR, but honestly, it's basically the same book as Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, but Hitler crossed out and FDR put in place because they were backed by the same people.
Yeah.
But again, I've got a whole section on that. Don't you worry.
Yes, I thought, yeah. But yeah, no, he was somewhat of a believer in togetherness and governmental power being the be all and end all, shall we say? And again, managerialism. In fact, we've actually got some Burnham. We've got some Burnham.
We actually have some Burnham for once, because he talks about his book, The Managerial Revolution, deals a lot with the Soviet Union and with Nazi Germany, but also in the most kind of elucidating passages about Roosevelt and about New Dealism, as he calls it. He refers to basically what has become neoliberalism as New Dealism. It's a little bit confusing. There's an archive.org one here. I'm using the kind of the website-based one because the PDF I found was a little scrambled in terms of pages. But if you're reading along at home and you've got the reading list here, there's actually a good archive.org version. This is on page 191 of the actual book, and 195 or 196, depending on which PDF version you have. It seems to vary between the two.
It's not the easiest version to work with.
No, I'm afraid it isn't.
It'll do. It'll do.
You can actually full screen it, but yeah, it does. It isn't the best, but I don't know, Trig. Do you want to read this quote? I think it's not interestingly enough.
Let me just find a better. There we go. That's a better way of doing that. Where does it start? Interestingly enough, as New Dealism develops, it draws always closer to the other managerial ideologies. The notion that there is always one party, the New Deal Party, and that can represent the American people is no longer unfamiliar. The successful propaganda of a third term was simply a narrative expression of the doctrine of an indispensable leader.
Yeah. It's amazing because Roosevelt had basically made history by becoming a third and then fourth term president.
Yeah.
He had made himself an effective dictator, and he'd done so through the same rhetoric that Hitler and Stalin had used. Yeah.
In each Roosevelt election, the ideological line has been sharper. It was fascinating to observe that when Roosevelt appeared to the people in his brilliant 1940 election speeches, he called for the support of all classes, including production men, technicians in industry, and managers, with one most notable exception: never, by any of the usual American terms of businessmen or owners or bankers or even industry, did he address himself to the capitalists. It was in Wilkie's speeches that were defending businessmen and private enterprise, and in the words and phrases correctly expressed the social reality.
Yeah, Wilkie was the head of the right wing, supposedly, of the Democratic Party that got very angry at Roosevelt, especially during his third term campaign. We'll go into a little bit of it as we talk about Roosevelt as a dictator, which is our last topic before we sum up. But what happened really is that Roosevelt managed to take over the party machinery of the Democratic Party, take over a lot of their cities, and then basically become the default managerial ruler of America. It's amazing how he was able to do this, but Burnham rightly describes the fact that under Roosevelt, America was a one-party state.
Yeah. Yeah, literal dictator. And as far as I know, everything that he said, everything that he put through got through, no matter how hard people tried to filibuster, etc. Those filibusters were smashed and broken. I don't think he was using the same methodologies that became sort of so popular, really, of late with. Oh God, what's the system that they use these days? Presidential decrees or whatever they are, but
Well, he used executive orders. He
executive
was one
order.
of the first.
Oh,
Yeah.
he was. Yes,
He did. He used. We'll get to that as well. He actually extended executive power much further than Woodrow Wilson did. But a point I've made here that I forgot in my notes is that there is no FDR without Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson builds upon the extension of executive power.
Yeah.
Sorry, Roosevelt builds upon the extension of executive power that Woodrow Wilson brought in.
Yes.
You know, he put a lot of cracks and holes in the Republic. Roosevelt knocked it down. He did really become an American king.
Yeah.
And he only did so by building on the destruction of the principles of the American Republic that were brought in place by his, Democratic predecessor, Woodrow Wilson.
So, as I have always said, and I mean always said, good God, this is something I get rather tiresome for saying, apparently, according to some, that you don't let potential tyrants have powers. Even if a government is the nicest government in the world and what they're asking for seems absolutely lovely and frilly and, oh, I'll never use it for nasty powers. And yes, it's just in case the Islamists rise up or whatever it is that they give us a reason, and it seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. You do not know who's round the corner who is going to utilize that power for a very, very extreme situation. And as we have now in the UK, in the US, and all over the place, we are literally inches away from, well, we are already in the most authoritarian government you've ever seen in your country. They, if they wanted to suddenly jackboot up and start, locking people in their houses and telling them they couldn't go out, at night or during the day. Oh no, we're already there, aren't we? They have all the powers to do that, and this is a classic example of that. Woodrow Wilson set everything up for Roosevelt to just walk in and go, well, we'll just turn that one up to 11 and that one up to 11, and we'll add a little bit of this as well. Job done.
If you want to get a bit more of this in a general sense, we don't really use it here because we kind of go into a bit more detail and use some of the same sources that we used in it. But Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs, because I think there's actually a Higgs article we use later on. But Robert Higgs is quite a good source for a lot of the stuff that we talk about. He uses many of the same kind of Rothbard and Mises and historical sources we do, but his books on kind of Leviathan and the functions of state are very good supplemental reading to the series, even though we've not really been using them, because we're kind of using the same primary and secondary sources that he did. But that is really his take on not exactly what we've been doing. It's one of the more similar things. I think the most similar books to kind of this series is like Hopper's, obviously, Democracy, the God That Failed, and things like Christ and Leviathan, and obviously Sam Francis's Leviathan and Its Enemies, which we'll be bringing in very heavily as we get towards the end of this series, because it is so good at summing up a lot of the stuff once you get to the 1950s. But it is very worth looking at those. There's a second quote here from the Managerial Revolution, because once again, Burnham, like Mises, is writing within the time period. He's writing this actually in the 1940s. Roosevelt is still alive when he's writing this, which again is quite extraordinary, because Burnham's become kind of a prophet of the right in many cases, but his work was really kind of lost and then rediscovered. But there's I think it's on page 244, it's the second quote there. It starts with, "We must be careful not to identify."
We must be careful not to identify the New Deal and the New Deal. Yeah. I've got it. It's 240.
Oh, 240. Okay. Yeah, it's 240 within the book itself. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's 244 within the PDF if you're reading along. So we have to have 2-page references so we don't get confused, in case you haven't noticed.
And that causes confusion in of its own right.
It does. Yeah, PDFs don't match up. The digital sources we have to use to show you these on stream don't match up with the actual page numbers of the books. Because obviously to show it on stream, we have to have some sort of digital copy of it. So that's why I make 2-page references generally, because I do share my sources all the time at the end of these streams. It will be in the pinned comment, as it always is. Hey, do you want to read this one too, Trig? Because I've been kind of getting scatterbrained and just talking.
Sure. No, that absolutely. We must be careful not to identify the New Deal and New Dealism with Franklin Roosevelt and his acts. Roosevelt is a brilliant and demagogic popular politician.
Demagogic.
Demagogic.
He's a demagogue.
Yeah, yes, quite. Sure. Yeah, demagogic. Popular politician who did not in the least create, but merely rides when it fits his purpose, the New Deal. The New Deal sprang from the inner structural drives of modern society, the forces that are operating to end capitalism and begin a new type of social organization. The same forces which, at later stages and under different local circumstances, produced the revolutions in Russia and Germany. The firmest representatives of the New Deal are not Roosevelt or the other conspicuous New Deal politicians, but the younger group of administrators, experts, technicians, bureaucrats who have been finding places throughout the state apparatus. Not merely those who specialize in political technique in writing up laws and concealed jokers in, let's see if it will.
Yeah.
Handling Roosevelt's new democratic, dramatic idea.
Yeah. But also those who are doing the actual running and extending government enterprises. In short, the managers. What Burnham is describing here very, very astutely is that in Nazi Germany, in Soviet Russia, and in Roosevelt's kind of New Dealism age, the state only functions if those who are within the state institutions are in line with it and are perpetuating it. He is, again, brilliantly talking about technocracy and the technocracy we've seen in things like the EU in the 1940s. He's talking about technocrats in the contemporary time period. This is why Burnham's work is seen as so prophetic, and some of it is, I think, the Managerial Revolution, which we're reading now, is the most quoted of his works, but we'll also be utilizing, as we get into the 50s, his work on the Machiavellians, because that is a very, very useful analysis of a lot of what comes about with the post-war consensus, and so is depressingly titled his later book, The Suicide of the West. But here, once again, he's identifying the fact that the real face of the New Deal are the people in all the agencies that FDR sets up. They are the administrators, they are the bureaucrats, the technicians, they are this new generation of people who don't see themselves as, bringers of free enterprise. They are employees of the state. And those state employees who work in these technocratic offices are the real managerialists. It is not simply a faceless machine. It is a large group of people who are trained and who are propagandized by the elite to keep this machinery going. And he's really also kind of elucidating there the self-perpetuating nature of the institutions, in that if you fill these government agencies up with managerialists, what you will get is further answers towards managerialism. It becomes, again, a self-perpetuating machine.
Yeah, answers to questions that don't really exist. But they'll definitely have a meeting to work out the answer to it.
Yes.
Ugh.
And they see management in of itself as virtuous. And again, Roosevelt is the man of the hour, but I think a Roosevelt-like figure, with the political environment of the US at the time and how compromised the checks and balances of the Republic had already become, was almost inevitable. Roosevelt is just the vessel for technocratic government. he in of himself is an egotist. He in of himself is, somebody who absolutely believes in the enhancement of his own power. But it is not FDR that is doing this. He is simply the person riding the Leviathan. And again, quite a powerful observation there from Burnham, and why his work is still so relevant.
Yes.
But yes.
Yes. Monster either way.
Yes. Exactly.
Ugh, and as someone who's I've experienced far too much management in my life. It's yes. It does find ways of growing itself and justifying itself to almost limitless ends. And yeah, no, the New Deal is something that's saying there. It is extolling the virtues of communism, of National Socialism, of the managed everything, the managed government, the managed economy, the managed, proletariat, the managed peoples of your country to the nth degree, which is where socialism. Sorry, go on.
Eventually, as we get to with John T. Flynn's The Myth of Roosevelt, it's called the Roosevelt Myth, which is actually one of the last things we quote. I'm jumping ahead a bit here. And what eventually becomes is, especially during the Second World War, are managers of the mind and managers of the message and managers of the truth.
Yeah.
It becomes very incredibly, Brave New World 1984 by that point. But that is where it is leading, and this is the start of it. But the first thing you have to create are all these societal level middle managers. They are the people who become invested in the system and keep the system going. But how did FDR come about? Because I know you've been reading this a lot quite heavily too, Trig.
Well, Sutton's work.
Yes.
Yeah, I love Sutton's work. I think out of all of it, I think Anthony Sutton's stuff is the best books that I've run into in all of these series. They have been not just eye opening, but literally jaw dropping at almost every single opportunity. And yeah, no, hitting that sort of chapter 12 where it's like, oh yeah, here's my right hand man. He's got a copy of this this book by an Italian fascist theoretician for everyone to read. Have a good look, see what you think. How did he get there? Well, the same way that Hitler got there, the same way that the Bolsheviks got there, and the Mensheviks got overthrown by fat cats in Wall Street throwing whopping great chunks of money at them. It amazes me. It really does how that lot have A, how they get away with it, and B, why they were doing it. It is the why Wall Street would invest in what strikes me on the face of it as the death of capitalism. It seems bizarre at first until you realise that, well, it is the death of capitalism for everybody, from the middle downwards. But everyone sat at the top, the big industrialists, the big technocrats, the big industrial, the managers of everything, the people that own everything. It is just a way for them to consolidate huge amounts of power because they get to set up. They built all of the factories in Stalin's Russia. They funded and helped build Germany back after the First World War. They are the ones getting first dibs, their hands in everything, and getting the people who will in the future be in power into their debt. It's horrendous.
Again, I would advise people to just go and read Wall Street and FDR.
Yeah.
Because there is far too much to cover here. But the high points are really that Roosevelt was, in his career before being a politician, a financier. He is someone who profited off German hyperinflation. He's someone who ran the he ran an investment corporation that was very, very high end. He was one of the organizers of the American Investigation Corporation, a high-powered financial syndicate.
One of the
Roosevelt
boys.
formed the financial firm Roosevelt and Sons in the late 18th century. Roosevelt was, despite outwardly professing to hate financiers, a financier. That's where his money came from, and that's where he was financed from. He was friends with a lot of people in big business. He was very outwardly funded by a large amount of corporations who wanted to be picked as winners, just like with Teddy Roosevelt. He had his own friends in the business world. There is a lot of stuff in Wall Street and FDR about 120 Broadway and how that building was where the Soviets were funded from.
Oh,
it's
God.
where GE had a lot of their stuff. 120 Broadway, he does leave room for it being a coincidence, but it's a hell of a coincidence that all of this stuff happens in the same building. Roosevelt must have known these people and walked past them. It is naive to believe that there was not collusion going on with all of this stuff headquartered at 120 Broadway. And he just goes through point by point the fact that Roosevelt was a Wall Streeter. He was descended from Wall Street families and backed financially by Wall Street. That's the big thing here, that in the 1940s, as was the case under Woodrow Wilson, the Democrats were still the party of Wall Street, very, very openly. That's how the politics worked. That is just how they worked. They got more donations than the Republicans from Wall Street. Again, he grew up in the financial world. He is of the financiers, for the financiers. And it is amazing that he could turn around and basically criticize these rich families who ran America, because the Roosevelts were one of the rich families who ran America. He is, again, doing the same outward rhetoric the Soviets did, but at the same time accepting their money. Just as Lenin did. Lenin outwardly hated international finance and the banks. And yet, international finance and capitalist corporations funded all of his, like we talked about last time, 5-year plan factories. And It is exactly the same story with FDR. FDR is somebody who is funded by the now well-established socialists in Wall Street, who we talked about on multiple occasions, who see socialism and very heavily state-regulated capitalism as their best ticket to get monopolies. It's become quite well-explored ground of this series, and I quite like that. I don't know, Trig, do you want to go into... I know you've been very excited about reading this book, so...
Well, yes, I mean... It's going on with what you said about the it's how to get this, and you caught me with a mouthful of pizza, you bastard. Just having a quick. I was like, he's talking. I'll grab a quick mouthful of Yeah, no, it. What gets me is that the Wall Street is still at it even now. Is that even now we still see. Or neocons, neolibs, the Wall Streets being very, if not Leninist, they're still very Trotskyist. Even today, the Forever Wars, as we've mentioned before, is a product of Trotskyism. It's the ideology behind it, even though it seems somewhat. It should be anathema to one another. It in fact isn't at the absolute top end, because it's control. It is forever money. It is forever change and control over ever increasing amounts of people, essentially. And yes, no, it's the work Sutton's done is fantastic. And here we go. This is a bit that I was looking for. Here we go. It is also reliably recorded that Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party, the first step to the modern warfare state, was financed by none other than my personal favourite, J.P. Morgan interests. Consequently,
Yes.
it should not surprise us to find Wall Street backing Roosevelt in 1928, 1930s, and 1932. It is always the same fucking names over and over and over again. In brief, we have shown that Roosevelt was a Wall Streeter, descended from prominent Wall Street families and backed financially by Wall Street. The policies implemented by the Roosevelt regime were precisely those that required by the world of international finance. It should not have been news to us that international bankers influence policies. What appears to have been neglected in the history of the Roosevelt era is that not only did FDR reflect their objectives, but was more inclined to do so than the so-called reactionary Herbert Hoover. In fact, Hoover lost in 1932 because, in his own words, he was unwilling to accept the SWOP plan, alias the NRA, which he termed, not incorrectly, a fascist measure. Which we could go back and read how
It is a fascist measure.
Roosevelt was very pro-fascist measures.
Well, the Brock, the person who brought in the fascist literature, was part of developing the National Recovery Administration. His assistant, General Hugh Johnson, came up with the National Recovery Administration and the SWOPE plan. There's a section here where it talks about the SWOPE plan. It was a scheme to force American industry into compulsory trade associations and provide exemption from antitrust laws. The thrust of the SWOPE plan was either you will come under, basically state-sponsored trade cartels, or we will trust bust you. It was based with a massive welfare carrot to quiet the misgivings of Labour and other groups. The General Hugh Johnson, who came up with the SWOPE plan, had 3 assistants. So General Swope of General Electric, who the plan was named after, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Lewis Kristen, of Fairlines of Boston. You will notice that both Standard Oil and General Electric were the 2 biggest American sponsors of Hitler, bar none. Standard Oil traded petroleum products to Hitler he should never have had. The American war, the German war machine could never have done what it did without Standard Oil. The same with General Electric as well. General Electric and its German subsidiary was massively involved in the German war effort and massively involved in funding Hitler's rise to power. And these are the 2 financiers, these are the 2 corporations that have assistants who are advising the people who are coming up with Roosevelt's plans. It's amazing. The SWOPE plan as well was it was greeted favorably by socialists. But what it was, as we've always seen, is that regulatory burdens always benefit large corporations who are the best tool to absorb them. Yeah. It really was, like we've seen in recent years, a war on big business. And Sutton lays all of this out, that really most of Roosevelt's quote-unquote business regulation was geared towards providing monopoly for his financial backers. And it was designed, as we'll get to, luckily the NRA failed. We've got a whole section on the NRA, not the gun group, the National Recovery Act itself, because of how blatantly illegal it was and how it was done via executive power. But the attempt was there really to strong-arm all American business under the auspices of the president and into line with these massive firms that backed him.
Yeah, no. A second, what was it? I just read there. William Schnell, FDR's New York associate, who had only a few years earlier been involved with the German espionage in the United States, that's 120 Broadway, was also part of this. It is endless, and oh my god, looking up 128 Broadway it's That address is very, very regularly cropping up in very interesting places. Excuse me. Beer and pizza. God.
Now that we've figured out who put him in power, we can get to, I think, some of the worst excesses of FDR's imposition on the public. A lot of this stuff affects business and business owners, but if you're anyone who he was a retail investor really in the 1930s and was a retail investor in the First World War, there is two actions of FDR that really show his complete dictator level dominance of the American financial system. And these are the Gold Reserve Act and the default of the Liberty Bond, which was facilitated by the Gold Reserve Act.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. Do you want to get into what the Gold Reserve Act won? Because it is amazing that this actually happened.
It's horrendous that this happened, is what it is. Considering America is supposed to be, the bastion of freedom, etc. The Gold Reserve Act. Here we go. Let's just. I'm just going to bring this up actually, because seeing as we've got it. Not that one. That one. Go. There we go. Signed by.
Actually,
sorry, go on.
Yeah, this is actually from the Federal Reserve History.org again.
Yeah. The act was the culmination of Roosevelt's controversial gold program. Among other things, the act transferred ownership of all monetary gold in the United States to the Treasury and prohibited the Treasury and financial institutions from redeeming dollars for gold. So in other words, the old, I promised to pay the bearer on demand the sum of, that was written, it still is written on a lot of British banknotes. No, you can't have your gold anymore, essentially. And
yes.
Don't be having any gold in your house either.
This was the final culmination of the not only abandonment of the gold standard, but the idea that American citizens were legally prohibited from owning gold,
which is wild. And can you imagine that today? That would mean that they would have to take away your computers.
No. Well, it's bullion. It's monetary gold.
Yes.
And the thing is that definition is quite elastic. If you're using gold as a store of value and not merely as a decoration, the government can then come and take your gold. If you melt down your jewelry and turn it into gold bars, you are turning it into monetary gold, and the US government can come and take your gold. It is a ridiculous policy, but it shows just how much of a total state the US was under Roosevelt, and two, how much of a dictator Roosevelt and his inner circle have become. That they could just do this.
So if I'd got loads of brass candlesticks and decided to just literally melt gold, pour it all over my candlesticks and go, no, I'm not storing any bullion here, there's just candlesticks, they would leave them alone.
Kind of, but it meant that trading in gold, and essentially gold as a monetary media, as a form of currency, was abolished, because they knew their debasement of the dollar would eventually lead to people simply trading in gold again. Gold is the ultimate fallback when it comes to legal tender. It is the one continuous thread from antiquity that people have seen, as a form of currency. Yeah. And the fact that Roosevelt did this is a demonstration that he is saying that the state is so powerful that it can take away any sense of natural exchange that you have. In fact, it will declare war on natural exchange, and even as you could see it as a non-fiduciary media, as a form of barter, that they are saying that no, you must trade in dollars. You can't trade in gold, and we are willing to go to extreme measures to force you to do that. And it also shows how undesirable they've made the dollar by this point as well. Because as we will get to, the second half of this, and the ultimate insult, I think, from FDR to the normal investing public, is the default of the Liberty Bond. I don't know, Trick, is there anything... I'm kind of getting ahead there. Is there anything else you want to say about the Gold Reserve Act? Because it is just an extraordinary measure and piece of history.
It is, and as I hinted at, it is wild that a country that is founded, the founding fathers wrote in their, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The concept of liberty is right there ingrained in the very DNA of the United States, and acts like this are such an anathema to the idea of liberty, to the that is it. You can't own this type of metal. The idea you can't own a thing is. I mean, it's not like you were smoking it. It's not like people were getting high. It's not like it was doing any harm. But no, it was that the only people that can own gold is the treasury. Ours now. Screw you guys. It's America is lost at this point, and don't think it ever recovered. It didn't.
Yeah,
The
Mulberry in the chat mentions fiduciary gold, but sorry, mentions fiduciary gold and silver. But the way they got round a lot of the silver stuff was to a lot of the SEC stuff of the gold. Silver is never really traded physically anymore. They reduce silver into security. So that's really how, in the subsequent years, they managed to eliminate monetary silver. But sorry, that's a side point. But essentially, what it's led to is that eventually it was reversed. But it was useless to be reversed because the policy of the US government in moving away from the gold standard meant that they'd kind of already done that anyway, in a way. This was just him coming out and basically slapping his balls on the table saying, no, you will stop using gold. We have abandoned the gold standard. The gold standard abandonment, as we'll get into, was 1933. And the implications of that we'll talk about via Rothbard here.
Well, you know what you can't do with gold that you can do with dollars, of course. It's very, very, very difficult. And alchemists have tried this for a very, very long time. It's very difficult to print more gold.
Yes, that's the point. That's why it's seen. That's why the gold standard was seen as a bulwark against inflationism. The whole point of the gold standard was to stop people from simply printing money.
Yeah, you can't just click your fingers and make more gold. You can't just, paint lead in a gold paint and call it gold, although people have tried that many times. Sometimes even got away with it. China, cough.
Yeah, the fake bullying stuff's funny.
But yeah, this is it. The gold standard is it stops you from being able to do the one thing that has caused so much harm in the last 100 years, which is the printing of money. Which is we've decided to print another $7 trillion worth of money. Don't worry, it's not going to affect the value of your dollar at all, as you see everything sort of double in price all of a sudden. Yeah, it's giving the government the ability to print money at this point. There's no need to get the mines open and start digging. You can just, wire up the printer. This is the only thing I've got to say. Yeah, gold standard, essential. Money printer, bad.
Well, let me quickly take you guys through the default of the Liberty Bond, because this is a amazing work example of the just financial banditry of Roosevelt era America. Mm-hmm. So the Liberty Bond was one of the ways that Woodrow Wilson and the Americans funded the First World War. They sold people Liberty Bonds and victory loans. They were retired in the course of the 20s. But because the terms of the bonds were allowed to be traded, they had superior terms. Basically, there was a secondary market for them, and the debt from the first, second, and third Liberty Bond was rolled into the fourth issue. So basically, they kicked the can down the road. And the fourth Liberty Bond, it had the following terms: a coupon rate of a rate of 4.25%, which is quite generous. Original amount tendered, $6 billion. It's a big loan, but basically, it was the government promised to pay you 4.25% yearly if you invest in the First World War. And a lot of people had taken this up, and cumulatively it had built up. They built up quite the bill with this.
Hmm.
And a lot of people were due to make quite a lot of profit from the fact that they lent the American government money during the First World War. And they were going to make so much money actually because the bonds at the time stipulated they could be repaid in gold. Um, but yeah, the terms of the bond included the principal and interest hereof are payable in the United States gold coin of the present standard of value. The typical gold clause was common in both public and private contracts at the time. It was intended to guarantee the bondholders would not be harmed by the devaluation of the currency, which is precisely what Roosevelt wanted to do, and it's precisely what happens with inflationism. All your investments are harmed by inflationism. It makes investments unviable for the normal retail investor by design. However, when the U.S. Treasury called the fourth bond on April 15, 1934, it defaulted on the term by refusing to redeem the bond in gold, and neither did it account for the devaluation of the dollar from 20 per troy ounce in silver to $35 per troy ounce. So basically, there's been a almost halving of the real value of the dollar compared to gold. The 21 million bondholders, 21 million people, by the way, therefore lost 134 million troy ounces of gold, or approximately 41% of the bond's principal value.
Oof.
This was equivalent of $2.8 billion, and that's in 1918 dollars.
Yeah.
That's 2.8 billion in 1918. The legal basis for the refusal of the Treasury to redeem the gold was the Gold Clause Resolution in 1933. The Supreme Court later held this unconstitutional under Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is basically it addresses citizens' rights and equal protection under the law. Basically, the government said the law doesn't apply to us, ha ha ha, fuck off. But what happened was the Supreme Court decided it was unconstitutional and went beyond congressional power. But because of both the Gold Preservation Act and what facilitated it, which was Executive Order number 1602, they both basically did the same thing. The court ruled that the bondholders' loss was unquantifiable because the executive order had banned the sale of gold on the open gold market. So the Gold Reserve Act not only served to fuck over the normal American who wanted to store their money in gold, it also meant that even though they were declared illegal by the Supreme Court, even though their actions were declared unconstitutional, they still won because Franklin Roosevelt had made the economic situation in America so unrecognizable from 1918 when these people took out $6 billion worth of debt on behalf of the government to fund the First World War. He had fucked America so readily that they decided that the loss was unquantifiable and they just couldn't pay. That is the perfect demonstration of how Franklin Roosevelt destroyed America and looted the 20. This isn't just big business. These are 21 million people that he stole money from. And he stole money from people who invested patriotically in the war effort. It is just the fact that this doesn't get talked about is amazing as well. It is one of the greatest slaps in the face by a leader to the populace.
I'm amazed they didn't lynch him. Mind you, to be honest, I've been amazed that the American public haven't lynched a fair few leaders in the past. But that's you guys, they're far too forgiving and nice. Mind you, so
such is life under the total state. Like I said, even by 1933, when he'd just taken power, he had inherited a situation in which he was essentially king, and that is just the reality of it. That the American government could steal from its people, and by enacting other laws that further steal from them, they are able to get away with it. And it's the monopoly on justice, and that is what the monopoly on justice brings about.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be the king, I guess. Oof. That's so bleeding depressing. Can you imagine? Oh, it's not hard to imagine these days, but you invest in the government, you invest in these bonds, which are sold, as you say, at a very preferable rate, and you can get it in gold and this, that, and the other. It sounds like a great deal, and you come to recoup your investment, and you basically get told, no, go fuck yourself.
Well, there's a quick quote here from Rothbard. I nixed the Phase 3 quote because it's not as applicable, but we have reached now what Rothbard refers to as Phase 4 when he talks about currencies. He lists the start of it as 1931, but in America it starts in 1933, and he describes the effect that pure fiat currencies have.
Hold on.
He describes Phase 4 thusly.
Yes.
The world was now back to the monetary chaos of World War I, except that now there seemed to be little hope for the restoration of gold. The international economic order had disintegrated into the chaos of clean and dirty floating exchange rates, competing devaluations, exchange controls, and trade barriers. International economic and monetary warfare raged between currencies and currency blocks. International trade and investment came to a virtual standstill, and trade was conducted through barter agreements conducted by governments competing and conflicting with one another. Secretary of State Cordell Hull repeatedly pointed out that these monetary and economic conflicts of the 1930s were a major cause for World War II. So basically, the abandonment of the gold standard and the chaos that followed it is a major contributor to World War II. It is.
Yeah.
It created the mass adversarial economic policy and international economic policy that was only possible through currency warfare when things were no longer linked to gold, because there was no longer a set playing field. It is often seen as a limiting factor, and a lot of people will scorn the gold standard and say that, the national government in the UK and Franklin Roosevelt saved America and the world from the gold standard. What they really mean is that they unleashed all these kind of fiduciary demons and all of these policy demons on people, where the amount of money in your pocket is subject to the whims of whatever politician is handling the purse strings of the government right now. And that there is no way for you to fight back against that, because there is no mooring principle of what your money is actually worth. Your money is, in effect, fictitious, as all fiat currency is. And that's what Rothbard's getting at there.
And it just gets worse from here on in, really, doesn't it?
Well, another thing that we talked about managerialism. We talked about the fact that managerialism is only possible with the frontline managers and the bureaucrat. And I just want to go through really and list all of the different institutions that throughout the New Deal Roosevelt set up, a lot of which were either folded into administrations that exist to this day or just exist to this day. Anyway.
What is known as the alphabet agencies, which I noticed the list of alphabet agencies that are on Wikipedia is missing a few key alphabet agencies that people...
Yes, it is.
People would often actually more associate alphabet agencies with these days than the others, but
they talk about the modern era in later on, because alphabet agencies came to mean different things at different times.
Very much so. Yes, very, very much so.
But it's the same thing. The New Deal created the alphabet agencies that took over the economy, and 1990s and then the War on Terror created the alphabet soup, which took over the War on Terror. They are, in fact, the same phenomenon in a distant time period, and they're quite aptly called the same thing. But in 1933, there were... Oh God, it just keeps going. But I don't know, Trig. Do you want to try and list all of these, or should I?
I can have a bash at them. 1933, AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. 1938. I'm not going to go for the year. I'm not going to go. CAA, the Civil Aeronautics Authority. early Federation Aviation Administration, the Triple C, Civil Aviation Conservative Corps, CWA, Civil Works Administration, the DRS, the Drought Relief Service, the DSH, the Subsistence Homestead Division, and on and on and on and on and on. And then later into the modern era, where we start seeing people like the CHEER, also known as the CIA, the DEA, the DHS, the NSA.
Well, a lot of those came later, but
They are modern era ones, yes, but it's
the same spirit. Yes.
Same spirit, different letters.
Well, what you saw here is things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which still is a massive power production cartel in the Appalachians. You have the Federal Communications Commission. You have the Federal Housing Administration. You have what eventually became Fannie Mae as well.
Yep.
You had Federal Endowment for the Arts, Federal Endowment for Music, the Farm Security Administration. You have a whole host of either agencies that were superseded by agencies that had the same function, or ones that are simply preserved to this day. But the reason this is important is because what he does in all of these, he makes it boring almost. He makes it almost difficult to comprehend all these agencies. But all of these agencies have a remit. They all have personnel. They all have managerialists. And it is his way of just scattershot invading and cataloging and regulating every single aspect of American life. He has created these, by the end of it, dozens of agencies that interfere in all forms of economic and social and, political aspects of people's lives. What he has done here is essentially just created this mass class of societal managers. And he's done it under the auspices of saving people from, the evils of capitalism by just massively not only enhancing the power of government, but its sheer size. Its sheer size is completely just transformed during this period. And he does this again by the creation of institutions, which, as we've talked about, become self-perpetuating. They start to have their own interest. And rowing back institutions is one of the most difficult things to do in a modern democracy, because people become attached to them. They become, again, reliant on them. It is a very devilish trick to go on and just create all these things. But they end up, most of them end up never going away. They are disbanded in some way at some point, a lot of them, but they get folded into other bigger organizations, or they get replaced by an organization by a different name that has the same function. Or like the FCC, they just keep going.
Yeah.
It is just staggering the amount of the American state that FDR basically imagined out of thin air, and how different it is from how things were governed, even in the time of someone like Woodrow Wilson, who was, again, an arch enhancer of his own power, of the executive power. And all of these administrations, yes, they were overseen and funded by Congress, but as we talk about with the National Recovery Act, it was eventually voted unconstitutional, but he did try and get around it. He essentially gave the executive branch a budget higher than the previous decade of American spending combined to fund all these alphabet agencies, basically. He said that he could use America's money without congressional oversight. It is one of the biggest grabs for power in American history. And again, it was another alphabet agency. It was, confusingly titled the NRA. But the remit it had, the price controls it could introduce, basically it was never realized in full, but it was realized in part because, much like California, what FDR did, he kept bringing out all this unconstitutional stuff, and he just kept doing it at a pace the courts couldn't come up with. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. He went to war with the American judiciary, and in large part in his third and fourth terms won because of his role in the Second World War. Pre-war still, he attempted some just staggering power grabs. The National Recovery Administration was one of the most egregious. And it really did try and remove the oversight and funding of these alphabet agencies from the remit of Congress.
Yes, and they could fund it by the fact that it wasn't gold standard anymore, and they could print as much money as they liked, and no one really had any chance to know where the money was coming from. Who cared if you were getting money if you knew where that money was backed or not? I guess.
Well, we talked about this, and the
Yes.
people who helped draft the NRA were General Electric, Standard Oil, J.P. Morgan, investment bankers, and cartelized semi-governmental businesses. And they were the same people who wanted and funded Hitler.
Them.
The exact same people. It is amazing. But it is the same process as we talked about last week.
Mhm.
What Hitler did in Germany is exactly what Roosevelt is attempting to at this stage, which is bring under the government's wing all auspices of business and employment law, and to become, a completely nationally managed industrial state, to do exactly what the Nazis did, to bring all private industry under the heel completely and totally of the government. And to a large degree, he did succeed in doing that.
Yeah. God, we have so much. They really are the real they, though, aren't they? The J.P. Morgan, Standard Oil, etc., gangs. Really, over the last 120 years, have done so much harm and funded so many nightmarish systems, and never have I heard of an executive from JP Morgan dragged up in front of a war crimes commission, or you funded Stalin and Hitler. We think you might be responsible for the deaths of 100 million people, or at least partially. Say at least 1 million of those is on your head alone. We think you should rot in this jail cell over here. Never happened. They will throw. They'll throw Heinz, the 18-year-old lad who really basically didn't know what the hell he was doing and suddenly ended up being told to stand guard at a gatepost somewhere. They'll throw him in front of the Nuremberg Commission, but no, J.P. Morgan, no chance. And really, poor old Fritz or Heinz or whatever his name was, at the end of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials. I'm not saying these guys were innocent by any stretch of the imagination, but in comparison to these Wall Street bankers and these Wall Street sort of industrialists, a fraction of the responsibility. To be honest,
there's a couple of things I've deliberately glossed over here. There's an article I wanted to read a bit of called How FDR Made the Depression Worse, which is written by Robert Higgs, the author of
yes.
Crisis in Leviathan. We don't really have time for that, but it does explain in more detail basically how the NRA and NARA did what we said, and that it only benefited big business with its regulatory burden. But I would recommend, that will be in the notes, I would recommend reading that.
It's another Mises Institute. Mises Institute's got some really, really great stuff on it.
Well, they have a big multitude of authors, and again, people like Robert Higgs are some of the best, and I wish I may end up using a bit more of his work when we get a bit later on the time period, because it's more relevant to the post-war era than it is now. But like I said, it is something that uses a lot of similar sources like Rothbard, so I prefer to defer to the more primary source. But it is a good article. I would recommend reading How FDR Made the Depression Worse, because it is a good elucidation of that. But the last point I want to cover here is a point of comparative, I guess, history, I guess. It's a jumping off point, but I wanted to talk a little bit about... Are you aware of who Huey Long is, Trey?
I really wasn't until very recently. And the more I read about it, the more I'm like, oh man. Yes, as you put here in the notes, he did the same synthesis of left and right ideas that Hitler did, and was seen as a rival for FDR. I really wasn't until very recently. So no, I by all means feel free to tell me. Because I've got these what few notes that we have here up, and let's have a look. We've got a nice article from Wikipedia.
Wikipedia is actually pretty good on Huey Long.
Yeah,
There's a lot been written about him, but it is a point of historical fact that he was a thug. He was somewhere between like a union shop boss and a wannabe national socialist. He's someone who invoked both left and right ideas in an ideological soup, which really was to benefit his own power and his own inner circle. He was he was in the Senate, and most famously, he was the governor of Louisiana. And both as Louisiana governor and state senator, he ran the country like his own personal fiefdom. Sorry, he ran the state like his own personal fiefdom. In many ways, he mirrored a lot of what FDR did. He couched his rhetoric in more Marxist terms, and he couched his rhetoric in in enhancing the welfare state and the welfare of the people. And a lot of very unintelligent leftists have actually become longists and fans of Long. Not realizing that essentially they're national socialists. That's really what Long was. He was a pound shop Louisiana, dollar store national socialist, and ultimately a self-serving thug. But his, Roosevelt's opposition to him, and he was eventually assassinated. A
yeah.
lot of people think of the orders of Roosevelt, but a lot of Roosevelt's opposition to him was not really to do with his ideas. It was more to do with the fact that he was trying to do Roosevelt's trick. If you research Longism and what Long was trying to do, it is identical to what FDR was trying to do. Yet Huey Long is remembered as a fascist thug, and Roosevelt is remembered as the greatest president who ever lived. Yet there is not really a material difference between what they wanted socially or economically. And I think that remains one of the starkest comparative points of history, in that, they always say that victors write history, and it's true. But the fact that Longism is so similar to what Burnham would describe as New Dealism, and yet history remembers the two so differently, is such a great reminder of that. But yeah, Huey Long would be a footnote if people didn't keep bringing him up because they think he's quote unquote socialist based, but he's like I said, he was really just a thug who got assassinated. But he is one of the closest political analogs to FDR within the time period, especially in American politics. And I just think the comparison of the two is rather amusing when you get into it. But yeah, Huey Long, I'd look him up. He's someone who is worth researching if you're interested in essentially debunking a lot of FDR, because, like I said, he is almost indistinguishable.
He does. I mean, I've got to say, I like his taste in suits. I think I actually own a very similar suit to that. But yeah. Fascistic demagoguery.
Closer to a French Catholic Mussolini, yes.
Yes.
He was much more inspired by classic fascism in that term rather than Nazism. But really, the economic side of it is all the same. It is all Keynesian, government-controlled, and tightly regulated. Hilariously, people refer to fascist systems as capitalistic, when in fact they are an anathema to that, as I think very successfully explained during the course of this series. But it's more of a point of FDR effectively, especially by the time he won his third term, was a dictator.
Well, yeah. And he was an open supporter of fascism. More reading this article, it doesn't seem that he was massively different from FDR. In fact, I think FDR probably would have liked him out of the way just in case people started going, hold on a second, he's saying very similar things to you. Because I don't think he was probably not delivering it with the same or shall we say, a more verve and gusto, and yeah. I don't know. I need to see him in. I wonder if there's a video of him somewhere speaking. He does. Maybe he's maybe his delivery was not as well done as Roosevelt.
Well, unfortunately, we're not able to. Well, not. It's a bit long-winded to use Ralph Raico's Great Wars and Great Leaders, but we have actually an article here that I think is very relevant by Ralph Raico, which talks along some of the lines of what he talks about FDR in Great Wars and Great Leaders, which is a great book. I'd recommend reading it. We just don't have time to use it because it is quite long in the tooth, but it is wonderful if you want to understand it properly. There's also a book called Classical Liberalism in the Austrian School, which I'm basically pilfering to write a speech on. I'll probably be presenting in the autumn. So it's not all set yet, but it's looking like I might be speaking at an event in London and having the essay published in a collection of essays. So that's quite exciting. But yeah, I'm basically copying Ralph Raico's homework for that. Very, very talented author, and it's great there's so many of his articles on the Mises Institute because he's very good at talking about this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's FDR and the collectivist wave. In granting official diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union in November 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was unintentionally, of course, returning to the tradition of American foreign policy. And it is amazing that is, again, not something that is recognized. We talked about the fact that during the 1920s and early 30s, that the the New York Times had essentially published verbatim Stalinist propaganda from its foreign correspondent. But the allyship of Joseph Stalin and Roosevelt was not merely a convenience of the Second World War. It was a point of American policy.
Yes. Damn. In the days of the New Republic through the 19th century and into the 20th, in the days that is of the doctrine of neutrality and non-intervention, the US government did not concern itself with the morality or, often rank, immorality of foreign states. How that is not the case these days. That is, a regime was in effective control of a country was sufficient grounds for acknowledging it to be, in fact, the government of that country. Really? I wonder how they'd feel about Taiwan.
Well, that's the point is that FDR was picking and choosing with that.
Yes.
He was unintentionally doing it, but he was doing it in a very politicized way. It's the false neutrality of the establishment. He talks here about the collectivist wave, though. He says there was a peculiar affinity between Roosevelt's New Deal and the European dictatorships, on occasion extended even to fascism and National Socialism. Correct term, for Nazism. Early on, FDR referred to Benito Mussolini as the admirable Italian gentleman, stating to his ambassador in Rome, "I am much interested and deeply impressed with what he has accomplished." Again, Mussolini in turn flattered what he saw as the New Deal's aping of his own corporate state in the NRA and many other measures. It's true that the New Deal and Roosevelt was part of the international collectivist wave that went on at that time. And he was very much in character with being in bed with both Mussolini and Stalin, because he had the same goals and he was undergoing the same process, maybe not to the same degree. We talked about the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is one of FDR's biggest public works, and it was passed in its first 100 days. It was very similar to almost like a Hitler Youth organization, really, if you want to look at it like that. It brought people into these great state works and educated them that they needed to rely on and trust the state. Whether or not you see it to that extreme degree, it is exactly the kind of public works patriotic scheme that instills the values of the establishment in these young men that the fascists and the Soviets had. It is a massive collectivist work scheme. And whether or not you believe that these people are indoctrinated or not. The very fact that they are being directly employed en masse by the state is hugely powerful.
Oh yeah, people tend to get very very happy about the hand that feeds them. They like that hand. No matter how corrupt or evil the state might be, if you're in its employ, you tend to like that state. It is no different from a dog, or dog defending his master, even though his master might be a right evil bastard. He knows where he gets his food from. We are little different, unfortunately.
Well, like I said, the difference between FDR and Mussolini and FDR and Stalin is only a difference of degree. They both want the same thing, and America was still put on the same track. Reiko ends this by saying America under FDR did not, of course, follow Germany and Russia on that fateful road to the bitter end.
No.
The main reason for this lies, as scholars such as Seymour Martin Lipset and Aaron Feinberg have recently written, in the deep-rooted individualist and anti-statist tradition dating back to the colonial and revolution times that never quite extinguished. Try as he might, Franklin Roosevelt could only bend the American system so far. But the problem is it never stops with Roosevelt. And the problem is that he bent it so far that in many ways it did break, and in many ways it was never quite the same again. I think that's quite a hopeful ending, and I think that Mr. Reiko might have a bit more of a dim view of things now, because this was written in, I think, 1998. This is pre 9/11. I think post 9/11 you will really see that opinion probably change with a lot of more libertarian authors.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 9/11, 2001 changed. It changed everything. It really did. And in no way, shape, or form for the better. No way, shape. I can't think of one thing it changed for the better. And well, we can do a 9/11 special at some point. We've already talked about a few questions I have, just one or two questions I have about that. But yes, and the what does led to? I'm sure Ralph. It says here 1936 to 2016 as he died.
Yes.
That's a shame. Mind you, not a bad innings. 80. Could do.
Not bad things at all, and like I said, he had very, very good collected works. I'd recommend reading basically everything you can by Ralph Reiko, and there's quite a lot of it over in the Mises Institute to shill them again.
Yes.
We're not affiliated, but we do use a lot of their resources.
Yeah.
There's one final quote I wanted to read, and actually, you know what, Trig? I think you should read this because it's really good.
Is this the Roosevelt myth one? Yes.
This is from a book I wish we'd have time to use more of. Again, I'd recommend reading it. It is The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn, and this is on page 183 or 192 if you're using the same PDF we are. But yeah, go on, Trig.
The title is The Righteous Bosses. There has never been in American politics a religion so expansively and luminously righteous as the New Deal. From the beginning to the end, it was consistent in one heroic enterprise: war to the death upon evil, upon greed, poverty, and oppression. It had, in fact, one monstrous enemy against it, which it tilted its shining spear 7 days a week, and that was sin. If you criticized the New Deal, you were for sin. You wouldn't want to be a sinner, would you? Yet it must be conceded that amongst the warriors of the New Deal were many whose presence in the army against sin was a little surprising. One such collection of men were those who are called leaders by their friends and bosses, by their enemies in big cities. What were the leaders of these great grafting organizations doing on the side of angels?
It's a great way. Basically, what he's saying is that the union bosses, aka the mafia,
yeah,
he's on the side of the New Deal. But the quote before that, the point where he basically just says that the New Deal is a religion, and
Yeah.
they went about it like a jihad. It was
Mhm.
essentially a jihad against capitalism. And if you weren't trading under the auspices of the state, you were a sinner, and you were of sin. I think that's just the best way of putting it I've really ever seen. Very
Yes.
good quote there, Mr.
Yes.
Flynn.
You wouldn't want to be against you and me for sin, would you? I mean, it really is. That's oof. Yeah. So the mafia were pro the New Deal. Of course they were. Of course they were. In New York City, Tammany Hall was the organization that managed the democratic host of the city. It had long and at times unsavory existence. Its motto was, "To the victor belongs the spoils," and those spoils consisted not merely in jobs that went to the party workers, but to those great enterprises that fed upon the state, and that were included under the name of graft. Illegal graft was the levy of extortion upon contractors, gambling houses, and commercial prostitution. Commercial vice of all sorts. There was, however, an area known as legal graft that consisted of various kinds of profits organizations and favourites made out of ordinary legal businesses. So that is great. I do like that. That's a good quote.
It really just brings it home, the fact that it's this strange coalition of people who see themselves as righteous, but are in fact, unions and, by extension, organized crime.
It's so it's the same story over and over again, though, isn't it? That how do people get so zealotry about politics? How do people can become zealots about this weird idea that has no basis in reality, Trig? I don't know. It's weird. But religions seem to spring up like that, don't they?
They very much do, yes. And it's a case of, I think, because they think they'll benefit from it.
Yeah.
They think that the big man is going to go and rob the people they don't like and give them some money. They essentially become toadies, or they see themselves as managers. That's the power of the managerial state, in that the bigger the managerial class becomes at the lower end of it, the more powerful it becomes, because you end up with, that's what the public sector is. If you have a large public sector like we do here in the UK, if it's nearly 50% of employment in terms of contracting as well, that are indirectly paid by the government, then of course you're going to have people who vote for bigger government, because that's how they get paid. But I think we've reached the end of our topics here, and we get into our normal kind of end thing as we're over 3 hours here.
We have hit the 3 hour point, yes.
Yes, of the power analysis. I think we've gone over a lot of our conclusions already within the body of this, but there's a few. I don't know. There's a few things I think we'll both want to cover in this, because it's very clear who benefits from this.
Yeah, FDR benefits. Big time, bigly. It's, as I said, it's good to be the king. But it wasn't just him. It was anyone, as you know, it was the side of angels. Those angels that could manage and dictate to those poor little guys at the bottom end. The managerialists, as you put there. I don't know if I like that word. It seems like it's got an extra syllable that doesn't need. Bureaucrats, administrators who gain their own pieces of this new controlled world. It is about control. FDR's regime, and I'm going to call it a regime from now on, was, it seems, somewhat significantly about control.
Well, as we talked about in our totalitarian episode, the difference materially between the early National Socialist system in Italy and Germany, pre-war, and the New Deal system in America, the difference between them was rhetoric, really. It was rhetorical. There was not really a material difference in their aims, goals, and methods.
I'm not really. I mean, apart from an obvious sort of one of it's this group that I'm not seeing an in group and an out group with FDR's
Oh, there
rhetoric.
is. Of course they are. You put the pin on there. It's
Mm.
he pretends that the bankers are the outgroup. He pretends the financiers and the capitalists are the outgroup. He
Yeah.
rails against them. He bashes them. He uses that as one of his main methods to gain power. Of course, there's an outgroup there. He's using he's saying the bankers and the capitalists never again.
Yeah, but he was one.
That's the irony. It's the thing is the outgroup doesn't have to be real. That's the point.
No.
It doesn't have to make sense, as we've learned in modern times when the outgroup seems to change weekly. It's about having one.
Yeah, and in fact, it's essentially, give or take a few euphemisms, the same outgroup that was being used in Europe by a lot of people.
Yes. Same outgroup the Soviets had, same outgroup the Nazis had. It was the dirty, dirty purveyors of international finance who'd got us all into this mess.
Yep.
And yet Lenin, Hitler, and FDR were provably being almost completely funded by those people.
Yeah.
I've also put that this really is this is the fruit of mass democracy. This is what happens when you have a state that has the power over justice and violence, but you allow people to, vote to enrich themselves. It's the nexus of state power, of people's supposed self-interest at the ballot box, and the state-nurtured crisis. And what you get when you tell people they can vote to enrich themselves, when that comes in contact with a state-nurtured crisis such as the Great Depression, you just get a vast expansion of state power and the spending, but in the name of the people. But the people are never the ones who administer the new public resources. The public institutions, that falls to, like I said, the managerial class. And the people who are the heads of the managerial class are the elites. So what happens is, in voting to enrich and save themselves, they are really just voting to enrich and empower the elites. And this is one of the fastest, I think, periods of this power grab outside of a war. The Great Depression as a crisis is kind of analogous to a war in that, the coronavirus pandemic as a crisis is analogous to a war in terms of how it's cost people rights and enhanced the size of the state. But all you end up doing is, once you get out of the 1910s and these states have begun to go on the track of the managerialism and essentially what has become totalitarianism, the course becomes set without a violent revolution. The peaceful handover of power only allows things to go one direction once a group has the monopoly on violence and justice. It is a very core tenet of libertarianism that once this happens, the difference between the Soviet Union and the USA is merely incremental. And I think that FDR is a wonderful he's a wonderful example of that. You can't point to anyone who more obviously is trying to incrementally aim for a socialist state.
It's incremental, but it's quick. It's many, many, many increments. Very, very quickly. And you never really recovered. They never have. To the point where, well, I was about to sort of bring up Obama and the Weather Underground and all sorts of that sort of nonsense, but that's many years down the line. But the point,
we'll get there eventually.
We will get there eventually.
But I think it's important, like we have done, to bring people through these periods of history, because we have left out a lot here. We've had to leave out the most well-trodden aspects of this history because you already know it.
Yep.
It's very important to bring out these alternate parts that you may not have been exposed to, or you may have been lied to about. I think it's very important to try, as we're doing, not to sound too grandiose, to bring about a different revisionist view of history that isn't just Soviet apologism, like all left historical revisionism is.
I know, and we are. I mean, I'm going to leave it at this point. which is where anything that's discussing the 1930s and ending at 1939, in theory, the canon is if you're talking about this point, you have to talk about the fact that Poland is getting invaded by the two totalitarian states of Germany and Russia, or the Soviet Union at this point. Very rarely are you being told why. Very rarely are you being told what's going off and exactly the reason why. And you know that Europe is now on the brink of yet another total war.
Well, we'll get into some of the roots of the Second World War next time when we actually do our Second World War episode, guys.
Yeah.
We're actually going to do it. That's actually coming next week.
See how I segued us in there?
Well, yeah, it is. But we're going to obviously go back to some of the 1930s stuff in that.
Yeah.
But we'll heavily reference what we've talked about today because it's very, very important you understand the situation domestically in America and in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Because they play very heavily and in the situation in the international financial system, because they play very heavily into what we talked about during the totalitarian special and what we'll be talking about during the Second World War, in that all of this comes together. The seeds of the Second World War, yes, they are in the First World War, but they are very basically in the way that people think about, manage, and imagine money. And you can't have the Second World War. I don't think you can have the Second World War without the abandonment of the gold standard.
No.
I don't think it's economically feasible. You can't have the Second World War without Woodrow Wilson's bringing into existence basically fictitious states. You can't have the Second World War without Wall Street financing Hitler and the Bolshevik. You can't have the Second World War without the dissolution of the British Empire and the end of the dominance of British power. You can't have the Second World War without someone like Franklin Roosevelt, who was able to act as a dictator and take America into a war in terms of the public will, it refuses to be in. All of this has to culminate for the Second World War as it happened to happen. And the very simplistic way you are taught it, what does the Federal Reserve, and the cartelization of the banks have to do with, Hitler? Well, I hope we've explained that.
We've certainly had a bash. And yet, there's also the Treaty of Versailles, the absolute mangling of the German and Austrian empires. The absolute annihilation of the German economy that is then funded. Watch previous episodes. We've been through it all. This is the Second World War was an inevitability. When people say it's almost one world war with a brief period in the middle where everyone caught their breath and cashed the checks.
It isn't. It isn't. I think the view of that as one conflict causing another conflict is very simplistic, and people don't go into the mechanisms of how one did actually cause the other.
I mean, certainly they did, to a degree. One led into the other, and with what happened in between, it made the second inevitable.
I don't think it made the Second World War inevitable at all. I think that's a false point of history. I think what happened is you have to realize that the First World War didn't happen, it was caused. And the Second World War didn't happen, it was caused.
Yes.
Seeing them as deterministic fixed points in history is one of the worst aspects.
That's not what I was saying. I was saying what happened in between after the First World War. What made the Second World War inevitable?
I know. I know you're not saying that. But I'm saying that in a literal sense, that is what the traditional interpretation of history says. They say that both these wars were not only inevitable but unpreventable, and in a deterministic sense, kind of their fixed points that had to happen in history. Now, I don't think I was saying that, but I'm just using it as a jumping off point. And that again, there are hundreds possibly of points along the way where something could have changed that would have prevented the Second World War from happening as it happened. But the Second World War as it happened really is in the interest of this new managerial class. It is in the interest of FDR and those under FDR. It is in the interest of the new, coalition-obsessed British state. It is in the interest of, on the other end, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and fascist Italy. Because to keep these total states going, you need these events. Everyone wants a war because everyone's just trying to keep the circus going. And a war is the perfect way to do that.
Oh yeah, consolidation of power.
Yeah,
it is the ideal way of consolidating power, because the one thing everybody does when, oh my god, national security, etc., etc., let's get behind our dear leader and fight the filthy enemy. And, it doesn't matter which side you're on. The Germans felt exactly the same way about the situation as did the English, as did the Americans, as did, well, I wouldn't say the French. The French just went, oh no, not again.
I wish we had more
quick,
time
get the white flag out. Where is it? I've got it here somewhere.
We're 3.25 hours again on it, but that's about the normal time. We actually budget the time out on these quite successfully, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, Trig, before we go, because we are wrapping up now, do you have anything you need to shill? Just so I don't forget.
No, not really. I'll probably carry on with a bit of Deus Ex over the weekend. I may or may not. It does depend. I've got a bit of a weird weekend coming up.
Same.
But I don't really want to go into that. But I've got a very poorly family member, so stuff might happen, stuff might not. Either way, I'll have a bit of a blast at getting JC into France and getting around the Knights Templar castle and reading some spicy bits of text, if nothing else. And I will leave the room open in my service. I will probably get invaded by Di and other people again.
Oh no!
which actually that happened the other day, and it was just basically oh no, I'm being bullied a lot for 3 hours whilst trying to play the game, which was actually quite fun. But other than that, no, I might join Yiz on her show tomorrow. I'm not sure. I have also with Sergeant Sniper on Sunday, I think. If he sends me the link.
Yeah, I'm not sure the best way to get in contact with you is, though. It might be on Twitter. I'm not 100%.
I've got her on Twitter, so I think Twitter might be the best route. Because as you said, Yiz keeps on getting deleted.
Yes, she's Yiz the yeeted these days.
Yes.
But yeah, in terms of stuff, it's mostly on the channel. Honestly, we're getting a bit not self-contained, but I'm trying to keep things moving here. Thanks to people who donated and became members. You'll get a shout out on the next uploaded video, which I'm going to start doing because it's a bit long in the tooth in these streams. I'm hopefully putting out another video on Monday, like I said, about the COVID total state, and there will be an article on the Substack. The Substack is linked below. That's antipolitics.substack.com. I had a good reaction about both my permissible activism and my Harry Hay article. They both got pretty decent feedback from you guys, so I will try and make written content when I can. Like I said, I'm currently writing a 6,000-word essay about classical liberalism and its application to a modern British version of libertarianism, and I'm hopefully presenting that at a conference. Apart from that, I really don't have anything else to shill apart from seal of approval, which I still do every Wednesday when it's possible. And unfortunately, Rose has been quite ill recently because she took the Coof vaccine.
I can't believe that Harry Hay article you wrote got an actually it's hebophilia, and it's a Nambla's comment.
Oh, somebody came out and tried to defend Nambla. That was awful.
That was kind of, dude, of all the things and all the organisations in the world, you had to pick that one to defend? Wow, okay. Now let me see if you're on the list somewhere. Because that, I bet he is. They always are. But yes,
on the list.
Yes, no, we were both on Rose's thing, so I'll probably be on more Rose's podcasts in the near future as well. I should imagine.
Yes.
I enjoy
Rose's show.
Yes.
I'm probably going to end the stream now because I need to go lie down. To be honest with you,
Do it. Yeah. It's God, yes.
As always, these are absolutely slightly brutal marathons because the amount of information we have to relay. But I'm glad we're doing them, and at some point, I'm hoping to make these into both shorter form content, and maybe one day I might even, with the help of our lovely assistant, who I almost forgot to thank you, Evelyn, for all your help on the sources on this.
Indeed.
Thank you for basically walking us through a lot of the managerialist and kind of Mises source stuff too. That's been very, very helpful to have like basically a Mises reference guide. So our researcher and occasional guest is very vital to this process. They are basically the semi-silent third member of the channel. So big thank you to them.
Yes.
But yeah, we will see you guys. I'll see you guys hopefully on Monday and Tuesday with a written article, and Wednesday with seal of approval. And next Thursday when we do the Second World War. So yeah, hopefully lots more content. And I'm trying to fill up the week when I get time. So thank you guys and goodbye.
Take care.